Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Officer Daniel Reeves, badge number 4127, Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. I've been wearing this badge for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. Domestic violence calls where the victim protects their abuser. Drunk drivers who somehow walk away from crashes that should have killed them. Overdoses in gas station bathrooms, and bodies found in places that make you question humanity. But what happened starting on March 8, 2024, changed everything I thought I knew about this world and what's possible in it. It was a Friday night and I was pulling the late shift again. My partner, Rick Santos, had called in sick with the flu, so I was riding solo. Captain Morrison doesn't like us patrolling alone, especially on the night shift. But we were short-staffed, and someone had to cover the Eastern District. The Eastern District includes Route 19, that long stretch of two-lane blacktop that cuts through 15 miles of pine, forest between Millbrook and Cedar Falls. During the day, it's beautiful in that peaceful, small-town America way. At night, it's a different animal entirely. I'd been patrolling since 6 p.m., mostly routine stuff. Responded to a noise complaint at the Riverside Trailer Park that turned out to be teenagers with a stereo, helped an elderly woman whose car had broken down outside the Piggly Wiggly, and wrote a speeding ticket to some college kid who claimed he was late for his girlfriend's birthday party. Standard Friday night fare for a small county like ours. The kind of night that makes you forget why you became a cop in the first place, until something happens that reminds you. Around 10:30 p.m., I was heading back toward town when dispatch crackled through my radio. Unit 27, we've got a possible stranded motorist on Route 19, mile marker 14. Anonymous caller reported a vehicle with hazards on, driver possibly in distress. The dispatcher was Kelly Morrison, the captain's daughter, who'd been working dispatch for about 6 months now. She had that professional but concerned tone that good dispatchers develop when they're not sure if they're sending you to help someone change a tire or into something worse. I keyed my radio. Copy dispatch, Unit 27, responding to Route 19, mile marker 14, ETA about 8 minutes. Mile marker 14 was right in the heart of the pine woods, about as isolated as it gets in our county. No houses, no businesses, just trees and darkness, stretching for miles in every direction. The kind of place where if something goes wrong, you're on your own until backup arrives. The drive out there gave me time to think, which isn't always a good thing on nights like these. Route 19 has always made me uneasy after dark. It's not just the isolation, though, that's part of it. There's something about the way the trees seem to lean over the road, creating this tunnel effect that makes your headlights feel inadequate. The way shadows move in your peripheral vision, making you second-guess what you're seeing. Other officers have mentioned it too, though nobody talks about it directly. It's just understood that Route 19 is different. I'd responded to calls out there before, of course, mostly accidents, usually involving deer or drivers who'd fallen asleep at the wheel. But there had been other calls too, stranger ones. Cars found abandoned with no explanation. Drivers who claimed they'd been lost for hours on a road they'd driven dozens of times before. Reports of lights in the woods that turned out to be nothing when we investigated. The kind of calls that make you write careful reports and not ask too many questions. As I approached mile marker 14, I could see the hazard lights through the trees before I saw the vehicle itself. They were blinking steadily, cutting through the darkness like a mechanical heartbeat. The car was a white Ford Explorer, pulled over on the shoulder with its engine running. I could see the exhaust vapor rising in the cold air, illuminated by my headlights. The temperature was about 38 degrees, cold enough to see your breath but not quite cold enough for frost. I parked about 20 feet behind the Explorer, angled slightly to protect myself from any traffic that might come along, though traffic was rare on Route 19 at this hour. I left my blue lights flashing and grabbed my flashlight from the charger. It was one of those heavy-duty LED models that could light up a football field, and I'd learned to rely on it in situations like this. Good light can be the difference between life and death for a cop, especially when you're alone. Before getting out, I radioed in the plates. Dispatch Unit 27. I've got a white Ford Explorer, Georgia plates. I read off the number slowly, making sure Kelly got it right. Vehicle appears to be running. Hazards on, no visible occupants from my position. This was standard procedure, something I'd done hundreds of times before. But tonight it felt more important somehow. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the way the darkness seemed to press in around us. But I wanted dispatch to know exactly where I was and what I was dealing with. Copy. Unit 27. Running the plates now, Kelly responded. There was a brief pause, then she came back on. Vehicle is registered to Sarah Chen, 34, out of Atlanta. Clean record. No warrants, no flags. I stepped out of my patrol car, and the cold hit me immediately. It was that damp, penetrating cold that gets into your bones and stays there. The forest was dead quiet, except for the sound of both engines running and the soft clicking of the hazard lights. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just silence and the smell of pine needles and exhaust. I approached the Explorer slowly, my flashlight sweeping back and forth across the ground and the surrounding trees. The driver's door was slightly ajar, just enough that the dome light was on, casting a weak yellow glow onto the pavement. I could see that the seat was empty, but there were clear signs that someone had been there recently. The seat was still warm when I got close enough to feel it, and I could see the impression where someone had been sitting. "Police! Anyone need assistance?" I called out, my voice carrying into the darkness. No response. I tried again, louder this time. "This is Officer Reeves with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. If you can hear me, please respond." Still nothing. I used my flashlight to examine the interior of the vehicle. The keys were in the ignition, engine running, heat on full blast. On the passenger seat there was a black leather purse, a cell phone, and what looked like a half-eaten sandwich still wrapped in paper from a gas station. The phone was showing missed calls and text messages, but I didn't touch it. That would have to wait for proper procedures. In the cup holder, there was a receipt from a gas station in Macon, time-stamped at 8:47 p.m. That was less than 2 hours ago, which meant Sarah Chen had been driving north when she stopped here. But why would someone from Atlanta be driving north on Route 19? The main highway between Atlanta and anything north would be Interstate 85, not this back road through the middle of nowhere. I stepped back and keyed my radio. Dispatch Unit 27. Vehicle is abandoned but still running. Driver's door is open, personal effects inside including purse and cell phone. No sign of the driver. I'm going to do a preliminary area search. Copy, Unit 27. Do you need backup? Kelly asked. I looked around at the wall of trees surrounding me. Standard procedure said yes, I should wait for backup before searching alone. But something about the scene bothered me. The car was still warm, the food was fresh, and someone might be hurt or lost in the woods. Every minute could matter. Negative. Dispatch. I'll do a quick perimeter search and call for backup if needed. Show me out of the vehicle at 10:47 p.m. I started my search methodically, the way we're trained. I began by walking a circle around the vehicle, looking for any signs of where Sarah Chen might have gone. The shoulder of the road was gravel and packed dirt. Not great for holding footprints, but I found a few partial impressions that looked like they might be from a woman's sneaker. They seemed to lead toward the tree line on the east side of the road. The woods here were typical for central Georgia. Tall pines mixed with oak and hickory, thick underbrush, and decades of fallen leaves creating a soft carpet that muffled sound. During hunting season, these woods would be full of hunters, but it was March now, and the forest felt completely abandoned. I followed what I thought might be a trail, calling out Sarah's name every few steps. "Sarah! Sarah Chen, this is the police. If you can hear me, call out." My voice seemed to be absorbed by the trees, not even producing an echo. It was like shouting into a void. About 50 yards from the road, I found the first clear footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft earth near a small drainage ditch, definitely from a woman's sneaker, size 7 or 8. The print was deep and clear, like she'd been walking fast or maybe running. The tread pattern was still visible in the mud. I marked the spot with a small flag from my kit and continued following the trail. The prints led deeper into the woods, toward what looked like an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. The path was overgrown with weeds and small saplings, but you could still see where trucks had once driven through. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes when I reached a small clearing where the old logging road intersected with what might have been a hunting trail. And that's where the footprints stopped. Not gradually, not scattered, but just stopped. Dead in the center of the clearing, there was one final, deep impression of Sarah Chen's sneaker, and then nothing. No more prints in any direction. No disturbance in the leaves, no broken branches or torn clothing. Nothing to indicate which way she might have gone from there. I stood in that clearing for a long time, sweeping my flashlight in slow circles, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical explanation was that she'd reached this spot and then stayed on harder ground where her footprints wouldn't show. But looking around, there was no hard ground. The entire area was soft forest floor, the kind that would hold the impression of a footprint for days or even weeks. I radioed for backup. "Dispatch Unit 27. I need at least 2 additional units out here and put in a call to the K9 unit. I've got a possible missing person situation." "Copy, Unit 27. Units are en route. ETA 15 minutes. While I waited, I expanded my search, but carefully. I didn't want to contaminate the scene any more than I already had. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any sign of where Sarah might have gone, but found nothing. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air. Officer Martinez arrived first, followed by Sergeant Walsh. Carlos Martinez was a good cop, steady and thorough, the kind of partner you wanted backing you up. He'd been with the department for 8 years and had that quiet competence that comes from experience. Sergeant Walsh was old school, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything and had the stories to prove it. "What have we got, Danny?" Walsh asked as he approached the clearing. I filled them in on what I'd found, showing them the footprint trail and the spot where it ended. Martinez documented everything with his camera, while Walsh examined the area with his own flashlight. Both of them had the same reaction I'd had: confusion and concern. "This doesn't make sense," Martinez said, crouching down to examine the final footprint. "People don't just disappear." "No," Walsh agreed. "They don't." The K9 unit arrived about 30 minutes later. Officer Janet Pierce and her German Shepherd, Duke, had been working together for 5 years and had an impressive track record of finding missing persons. Duke was trained in both search and rescue and criminal tracking, and he'd never failed to pick up a scent trail when one existed. Duke immediately picked up Sarah Chen's scent from her car and followed it along the same path I'd traced earlier. The dog moved confidently through the woods, nose to the ground, tail wagging slightly the way search dogs do when they're locked onto a trail. But when he reached the clearing where the footprints ended, Duke stopped abruptly. He circled the area several times, whining softly, then sat down and looked at Officer Pierce with the confused expression dogs get when they don't understand what's expected of them. "He's got nothing," Pierce said, running her hand through Duke's fur. "The scent trail ends right here, just like the footprints. I've never seen anything like it." We expanded the search to cover a half-mile radius around the clearing, but found nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no sign of struggle. As dawn began to break, we called in additional resources. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation sent a team, and volunteers from the community joined the search. Over the next 3 days, more than 200 people combed through those woods, but Sarah Chen had simply vanished. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance revealed several puzzling details. According to her family, she'd been driving from Atlanta to Cedar Falls to attend a monthly book club meeting at her friend Linda Morrison's house. She was supposed to be there by 9 p.m., and Linda had started calling her cell phone when she didn't show up. The route from Atlanta to Cedar Falls was straightforward. Take Highway 23 north for about 90 miles, then turn east on Cedar Falls Road. There was no logical reason for Sarah to be on Route 19, which would have taken her at least 30 miles out of her way. Even more puzzling was what we found when we examined her car more closely. The GPS navigation system was still active, and it showed a programmed destination that made no sense. According to the GPS, Sarah had intended to drive to coordinates that would have placed her in the middle of Blackwater Lake, about 50 miles north of where we found her car. Blackwater Lake was nothing but water and marsh, no roads, no structures, nothing anyone would want to visit, especially at night. I called Sarah's sister, Michelle, who lived in Decatur. She was devastated by the news, but she tried to be helpful. "Sarah's very reliable," she told me. "She's never missed a book club meeting, and she always calls if she's running late. This isn't like her at all." "Can you think of any reason she might have programmed her GPS to take her to Blackwater Lake?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Blackwater Lake? I've never heard her mention that place. Are you sure that's what it said?" "I'm sure. The coordinates are very specific." "That doesn't make any sense. Sarah's afraid of water. She can't even swim. She wouldn't go to a lake, especially not at night." 3 days after we found Sarah's car, I got a call that made the case even stranger. A fisherman named Earl Hutchins had found something floating near the boat launch at Blackwater Lake. It was Sarah Chen's car keys, still on the same keychain she'd been carrying when she disappeared. Just the keys, nothing else. I drove out to Blackwater Lake to meet with Earl and collect the keys. The lake was about an hour north of where we'd found Sarah's car, through some of the most isolated country in our part of Georgia. The road to the lake was barely maintained, full of potholes and fallen branches, the kind of road you'd only take if you had a specific reason to be there. Man in his 60s who'd been fishing these waters for most of his life. He was holding a plastic bag containing Sarah's keys, which were still dripping with lake water. "Found 'em floating right over there," he said, pointing to a spot about 20 yards from the shore. "Just bobbing on the surface like they'd been thrown in. Been fishing this lake for 40 years and I ain't never seen anything like it." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, keys don't float, do they? They're made of metal, should have sunk straight to the bottom. But these were just floating there like they were made of cork." I took the keys and examined them. They were definitely Sarah's, matching the description her sister had given me. There was a Ford key, a house key, and several others on a keychain shaped like a small teddy bear. But Earl was right about one thing. they should have sunk immediately. There was nothing about them that would make them float. "How deep is the water where you found them?" I asked. "Oh, that's the deep part. Must be 30, 40 feet right there. If they'd sunk like they should have, I never would have seen them." I thanked Earl and drove back to town, more confused than ever. How had Sarah's keys ended up in a lake 40 miles from where her car was found? And why were they floating instead of sinking? The FBI got involved because Sarah had crossed state lines. Agent Rebecca Torres was assigned to the case, a sharp woman in her early 40s who'd worked missing persons cases for over a decade. She interviewed me 3 times, wanting to know every detail of what I'd found and how I'd found it. "Officer Reeves," she said during our 3rd interview, "I've read your reports, and I have to say, this is one of the most puzzling cases I've encountered. A woman vanishes without a trace, leaving behind footprints that end in the middle of a clearing, and her car keys turn up floating in a lake 40 miles away. It doesn't follow any pattern I'm familiar with." "I know how it sounds," I replied, "but I've documented everything exactly as I found it. I've been a cop for 12 years, and I've never filed a false report." "I'm not questioning your integrity," Agent Torres said. "I'm just trying to understand what happened to Sarah Chen, and right now, I don't have any answers." The case remained open, but after 6 months with no new leads, it was moved to inactive status. Officially, Sarah Chen was still classified as a missing person, but everyone knew the trail had gone cold. Her family hired private investigators, offered rewards, and kept her story in the local media, but nothing came of it. I thought about Sarah Chen often over the next few months. The case haunted me in a way that others hadn't. Maybe it was because I'd been first on the scene, or maybe it was the complete lack of logical explanation for what had happened. But I found myself driving out to that clearing in the woods regularly, usually during my off-duty hours, just to look around and think. It was during one of these visits, about 4 months after Sarah's disappearance, that I discovered something I'd missed before. I was standing in the clearing where her footprints had ended, just looking around and trying to make sense of it all, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I was sure I heard it. A voice calling for help. A woman's voice, very distant and weak, but definitely there. And it was coming from underground. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground, and there it was again. Muffled and far away, but unmistakably a human voice calling for help. It sounded like, "Help me," repeated over and over, growing weaker each time. I immediately called for backup and requested ground-penetrating radar equipment. Captain Morrison arrived with a full team, including specialists from the state. They set up the radar equipment and scanned the entire clearing, looking for any underground structures or voids that might explain what I'd heard. "There's nothing down there, Danny," Captain Morrison told me after the scan was complete. "Solid earth and tree roots, that's it. No caves, no old wells, no underground structures of any kind." "But I heard something," I insisted. "A woman's voice, calling for help." "I believe you think you heard something," the captain said carefully. "But there's nothing down there. The radar shows solid ground for at least 30 feet down." I knew how it sounded. I knew that claiming to hear voices from underground made me sound crazy, or at least unreliable. But I also knew what I'd heard, and I went back to that clearing 3 more times over the next month. Each time, I could hear the voice, getting weaker but still there, a woman calling for help from somewhere deep underground. The 4th time I went back, I brought a small recording device with me. I pressed it against the ground and recorded for several minutes, hoping to capture some evidence of what I was hearing. When I played it back, there was nothing but static and the sound of wind through the trees, but I could still hear her when I put my ear to the ground. Sarah Chen, calling for help from somewhere impossible. I started researching the history of the area, looking for any explanation for what I was experiencing. What I found in the county records was disturbing. The land around mile marker 14 on Route 19 had a history that went back much further than I'd expected. In the 1940s, there had been a small mining operation near what was now Blackwater Lake. The Piedmont Mining Company had dug a network of tunnels looking for iron ore, but the project had been abandoned in 1947 when the company went bankrupt. According to the records, the tunnels had never been properly sealed, and their exact location had been lost when the company's records were destroyed in a fire. The entrance to the main tunnel system, according to a hand-drawn map I found in the county archives, had been located approximately 2 miles north of what was now mile marker 14 on Route 19, right in the area where I'd found Sarah Chen's footprints. But the ground-penetrating radar had shown solid earth. No tunnels, no voids, nothing that would explain voices from underground. Either the old records were wrong, or something had happened to fill in the tunnels since the 1940s. I submitted a formal request to Captain Morrison to excavate the area where I'd found the footprints. The request was denied due to budget constraints and lack of sufficient evidence. "We can't dig up half the county based on voices that might not exist," he told me. "I'm sorry, Danny, but the case is closed." But I knew what I'd heard. Sarah Chen was down there somewhere, and she was still alive. At least, she had been alive when I'd first heard her voice. By my last visit to the clearing, her calls for help had become barely audible whispers. I made a decision that probably violated several departmental policies. I was going to go back to that clearing one more time, but this time I was going to be prepared. I gathered equipment, a portable radio, emergency flares, climbing rope, a small shovel, and my off-duty weapon. If Sarah Chen was really down there, I was going to find her. I told my wife I was working late and drove out to Route 19 just before midnight. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of deep silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I parked at mile marker 14 and hiked back to the clearing, using my flashlight to follow the path I'd taken so many times before. When I reached the clearing, I immediately knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground. At first, there was nothing. Then, so faint I almost missed it, I heard her voice one more time. "Help me." It was barely a whisper now, but it was definitely there. I started digging. The ground was softer than I'd expected, and my small shovel made quick work of the loose soil and decomposing leaves. After about an hour of digging, I'd created a hole about 3 feet deep and 4 feet across. Still nothing but dirt and roots. I was about to give up when my shovel hit something hard. Not a rock, but something metallic. I cleared away the dirt and found myself looking at what appeared to be a metal grate or cover. Heavily corroded, but still intact. It was about 2 feet square, and there were gaps between the metal bars where I could see into the darkness below. I shined my flashlight down through the grate and saw what looked like a vertical shaft, maybe 4 feet across, disappearing into the darkness. The sides were lined with old timber that had rotted and partially collapsed over the years, but the shaft was definitely there. "Sarah!" I called down into the hole. "Sarah, can you hear me?" There was no response, but I could feel air moving up from below, carrying a smell I couldn't identify. It was musty and damp, like an old basement, but with something else underneath it. Something organic and unpleasant. I tied my climbing rope to a sturdy tree and lowered myself down through the grate. The shaft was deeper than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet, and it opened into what appeared to be a horizontal tunnel. The walls were roughly hewn rock, and the floor was covered with several inches of stagnant water. I waded into the tunnel, following it deeper into the darkness. The tunnel branched off in several directions, creating a maze of underground passages. I stayed to the right, marking my path with pieces of reflective tape so I could find my way back. After about 10 minutes of walking, I reached a larger chamber where several tunnels intersected. The chamber was maybe 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into the darkness above my flashlight beam. And in the center of the chamber I found them. There were 6 people sitting in a circle in the ankle-deep water, all of them perfectly still and silent. Even in the dim light of my flashlight, I could see that they'd been there for a long time. Their clothes were rotted, and their skin was wrong somehow. Pale and translucent, like they were made of wax. One of them was Sarah Chen. I recognized her from the photos her family had provided. She was sitting between an elderly man in a hunting jacket and a young woman in a waitress uniform. All of them had their eyes closed, and all of them were breathing slowly and rhythmically, like they were sleeping. But they weren't sleeping. When I approached Sarah and touched her shoulder, her eyes opened immediately. They were completely black, with no whites visible at all. She looked at me with those black eyes and smiled, and when she spoke, her voice was like whispers echoing in an empty room. "Officer Reeves," she said, though I'd never told her my name. "We've been waiting for you." The others opened their eyes then, all of them with the same black, empty gaze. They stood up slowly, water dripping from their clothes, and began to move toward me. "You hear us calling," Sarah continued, her voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You always hear us calling. That's why you keep coming back." I backed away from them, but they didn't follow. They just stood there in their circle, watching me with those terrible black eyes. "What are you?" I managed to ask. "We're what remains," said the elderly man. "What's left when everything else is taken away." "The mine," I said, understanding flooding through me. "This is the old mine." "The mine was just the beginning," Sarah said. "The tunnels go much deeper now, much deeper than they ever did before." I turned and ran, following my reflective tape markers back through the maze of tunnels. Behind me, I could hear them laughing, a sound like wind through broken glass. I reached the shaft and climbed up as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I filled in the hole I'd dug, packed my equipment, and drove straight to the sheriff's department. I found Captain Morrison working late in his office, going through budget reports. "Captain," I said, "I need to talk to you about the Sarah Chen case." He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. "Danny," he said slowly, "you need to let that case go. Some things are better left alone." "You know something," I said. "You know what's down there." Captain Morrison was quiet for a long time, just looking at me. Finally, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. 6 people have disappeared along that stretch of Route 19 in the last 15 years, he said. All of them found the same way Sarah Chen was found. Cars abandoned, footprints leading into the woods, then nothing. We've investigated every single case, and we've never found a trace of any of them. "But you know where they are," I said. "We know where they are," he confirmed. "And we know there's nothing we can do about it. The state police know. The FBI knows. Hell, there's a federal task force that's been studying this area since the 1970s. They call it a localized anomaly, and they file reports that nobody reads. So, we just let it happen? We do our jobs, Danny. We investigate, we file reports, and we move on. Because the alternative is to acknowledge that there are things in this world that don't make sense, and that would be bad for everyone. I left Captain Morrison's office that night knowing that I'd never be the same. I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, And now I had to live with that knowledge. I could never tell my wife, my friends, or anyone else what I'd really found in those tunnels. Who would believe me? But I also knew that I'd continue to hear them calling. Sarah Chen and the others, trapped in that underground chamber, waiting for the next person to hear their voices and come looking for them. Because that's what they do. They call for help, and eventually, someone always comes. I put in for a transfer to the day shift, and Captain Morrison approved it immediately. I don't patrol Route 19 anymore, but sometimes late at night when I'm at home with my family, I can still hear them calling. Faint and distant, but always there. Sarah Chen, the elderly man in the hunting jacket, the young woman in the waitress uniform, and 3 others I didn't get a good look at. All of them sitting in that circle in the darkness, waiting for the next person to hear their voices and come looking for them. The really disturbing part is that I know someday I'll go back. Because even though I know what I'll find down there, I can't stop hearing them calling for help, and eventually that sound will become too strong to ignore. I've been thinking about retiring early, maybe moving somewhere far away from Route 19 and those tunnels. But I know it won't matter. Once you've heard them calling, you'll always hear them calling. No matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to forget, they'll always be there in the back of your mind, whispering for help. And the worst part is, I'm starting to understand why they call. They're not trying to escape. They're trying to bring others down to join them. Because whatever's down there in those tunnels, it's hungry, and it's always looking for more. I don't know how much longer I can resist the urge to go back. Every day the voices get a little bit louder, a little bit more insistent. And I know that someday soon, I'll find myself driving out to mile marker 14 again, walking back to that clearing, and digging up that metal grate. But this time, I don't think I'll be coming back up. The thing is, I can already see myself sitting in that circle with the others, my eyes black and empty, waiting for the next person to hear our voices calling for help. And when that happens, I'll smile just like Sarah Chen smiled at me, and I'll say in that whisper echo voice, "We've been waiting for you." Because that's what we do. We call for help, and eventually someone always comes. And now you know why I'm making this recording. Because if something happens to me, if I disappear like Sarah Chen and the others, someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand that there are things in this world that don't make sense, and that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Don't go looking for me if I disappear. Don't try to find those tunnels. And whatever you do, don't listen too carefully when you're driving past mile marker 14 on Route 19 late at night. Because if you hear voices calling for help, they're not really asking for help, they're asking you to join them. You want to know what happened that night in Millbrook? Hell, I'm not even sure I know myself. But I'll tell you what I remember, what I saw, what I think I saw. My name's Officer Jake Morrison. 15 years on the force here in Millbrook County, Nebraska. Small town, you know? The kind of place where everybody knows everybody. Where the worst thing that usually happens is kids spray painting the water tower or old Pete Henderson getting too drunk at Murphy's Bar on Friday nights. Population 4,200 on a good day. Maybe 4,500 if you count the folks living just outside the city limits in those old farmhouses that dot the landscape like broken teeth. I've been working nights for the past 8 years. Started on days when I was young and eager, thought I could change the world one traffic stop at a time. But life has a way of wearing you down, and after my divorce 3 years ago, I found the darkness suited me better. Less people to deal with, fewer questions about why I looked like hell warmed over. Night shift in a place like Millbrook means you're mostly dealing with drunks, domestic disputes, and the occasional teenager thinking they can outrun a police cruiser on back roads they've been driving since they were 12. The department isn't much to look at. We've got 12 officers total, including Chief Patterson, who's been running the show for going on 25 years. Our station is an old brick building that used to be the post office back in the 60s, cramped and cold with fluorescent lights that buzz constantly and make everyone look like they're dying of some wasting disease. We've got 4 patrol cars, 2 of which are older than some of the officers driving them, and a dispatch system that cuts out whenever it rains too hard. But it's home, you know? These are good people, for the most part. They work hard, pay their taxes, and trust us to keep them safe. That trust is something I've never taken lightly, not in 15 years. When someone calls 911 in Millbrook County, they're calling because they believe we'll come running, because they believe the badge means something. And until that night in October, I thought I understood what that meant. It was October 15th, 2023. I remember the date because it was 3 days before my ex-wife's birthday, and I'd been dreading having to see her at our daughter's soccer game that weekend. The weather had been weird all week, unseasonably warm during the day but dropping down into the 30s at night. There was a fog rolling in from the cornfields that surrounded the town, thick and gray and heavy with the smell of dying crops and wet earth. By the time I started my shift at 11 p.m., you could barely see 50 feet in any direction. I'd been on duty for about 3 hours when dispatch crackled to life with the first call of the evening. Domestic disturbance at 412 Pine Street, the Henderson place. I knew it well. Pete and his wife Margaret had been married for 37 years, and about once a month they'd get into it over something stupid. Usually, it was Pete drinking too much and Margaret threatening to leave him, though she never did. They'd been having the same fight since I started working nights, and I'd responded to their place probably 50 times over the years. When I pulled up to the house, I could see the blue glow of their television through the living room window and hear their voices raised in anger. Pete was slurring his words, and Margaret was crying. I knocked on the door, and Margaret answered in her bathrobe, her gray hair disheveled and her eyes red from crying. "Oh, Jake," she said, and I could smell the alcohol on her breath too. "I'm sorry to call you out here again. Pete's he's been drinking since he got home from work, and he's saying things." "What kind of things, Mrs. Henderson?" I asked, though I already knew. Pete worked at the grain elevator, had for 20 years, and lately there'd been talk about layoffs. When Pete got scared about money, he got mean. "He's talking about that gun again," she whispered. "The one he keeps in the bedroom. Says maybe we'd all be better off if he just, you know." I sighed and stepped inside. The house smelled like cigarettes and boiled cabbage, and the television was turned up loud enough to wake the dead. Pete was sitting in his recliner, a beer can in one hand and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was a big man, probably 6'4" and close to 300 pounds, with arms like tree trunks from years of hauling grain sacks. "Evening, Pete," I said. "How we doing tonight?" He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. "Oh, just peachy, Jake. Just fucking peachy. You know they're gonna close the elevator, right? 20 years I've been working there, and they're gonna shut it down and move everything to Grand Island. Leave all of us high and dry." "I heard some rumors about that," I said, taking a seat on the couch across from him. "But nothing's decided yet, right? Maybe it won't happen." Pete laughed bitterly. "You sound just like Margaret, always looking for the bright side." "Well, there ain't no bright side to this, Jake. I'm 58 years old. Who's gonna hire a 58-year-old grain elevator operator? Tell me that." We talked for about 20 minutes, and gradually Pete calmed down. I convinced him to give me the pistol from his bedroom, a .38 revolver that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. and promised to return it in a few days when he was feeling better. Margaret made coffee, and we all sat around the kitchen table while Pete sobered up enough to remember why he loved his wife and why his problems weren't worth dying over. By the time I left the Henderson place, it was past 1 a.m. The fog had gotten thicker, and driving through downtown Millbrook felt like navigating through a gray soup. The streetlights created these weird halos in the mist, and everything looked unfamiliar, like I was driving through a town I'd never seen before instead of the place I'd lived my entire life. I decided to cruise through the residential areas, checking on the houses where I knew elderly folks lived alone. We'd had a few break-ins over the summer, nothing too serious, but it made me feel better to keep an eye on the vulnerable residents. Mrs. Chen on Maple Street, old Mr. Kowalski on Elm, the widow, Morrison, on Oak. No relation, despite the shared name. These were people who'd raised families in Millbrook, who'd watched the town grow and change, who deserved to feel safe in their own homes. I was driving slowly down Elm Street, checking house numbers in the fog, when I saw him. Another officer, walking along the sidewalk like he was on foot patrol. That struck me as odd right away. We didn't do foot patrols in Millbrook, especially not at 2:30 in the morning in weather like this. And besides, I was the only one scheduled for patrol that night. Danny Rodriguez was working dispatch, and Chief Patterson was home in bed like any sensible person. I pulled over to the curb and rolled down my window. The fog was so thick I could barely make out the figure, but I could see the dark uniform, the utility belt, the badge catching what little light there was from the street lamp about 20 feet away. He was walking with purpose, not wandering around like he was lost, and something about his posture suggested he was young, maybe in his 20s or early 30s. "Hey," I called out. "You on duty tonight?" He stopped and turned toward me, and that's when I got my first good look at him. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with short brown hair and a clean-shaven face. He had the kind of features that made him look trustworthy. Square jaw, clear eyes, the kind of face you'd see on a recruitment poster. His uniform was crisp and new-looking, like he'd just picked it up from the dry cleaner, and his boots were polished to a high shine despite the wet conditions. "Officer Thomas Mitchell," he said, walking over to my patrol car. His voice was steady and professional, with just a hint of a Midwest accent. "Just transferred in from Springfield PD. Chief Patterson asked me to familiarize myself with the neighborhood. That should have been my first red flag. Chief Patterson never mentioned any new hires, and in a department our size, word travels fast. We'd been trying to get approval for a new officer for 2 years, but the city council kept shooting down our budget requests. If we'd finally gotten approval to hire someone, I would have heard about it. Hell, I would have been part of the interview process. But the guy had the uniform, the badge, the utility belt with all the right equipment. He even had the proper radio on his shoulder, crackling with the occasional burst of static. When he stepped closer to my car, I could see the Springfield PD patch on his sleeve, and his badge number was clearly visible under the streetlight. "Well, welcome to the force," I said, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "I'm Jake Morrison, been working nights here for about 8 years. Quiet town most of the time." "Won't stay that way," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. "Never does in places like this. Small towns like to think they're immune to the kind of problems you see in the cities, but trouble has a way of finding you no matter where you are." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just smiled and tapped the side of his nose with his index finger. "You develop a sense for these things after a while, Morrison. Something's brewing tonight, I can feel it in the air." The way he said it made me uncomfortable. There was a confidence in his voice that suggested he knew something I didn't, like he was privy to information that hadn't been shared with the rest of us. But then again, if he was coming from Springfield PD, he would have experience with more serious crimes than we typically dealt with in Millbrook. Maybe he was just being cautious. "What kind of experience you have in Springfield?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "All kinds," he said vaguely. "Drug enforcement, gang activity, organized crime. You'd be surprised what goes on in small cities like Springfield. Lots of things that don't make the newspapers." Before I could ask him more questions, my radio crackled to life. Danny Rodriguez's voice came through the static. "All units, we have a possible breaking and entering at 1247 Maple Street. Homeowner reports seeing someone in their backyard attempting to gain entry to the residence." I recognized the address immediately. Mrs. Chen, a sweet 73-year-old woman who'd been living alone since her husband died 2 years ago. She was the kind of person who baked cookies for the mailman and always had a kind word for everyone she met. She was also the kind of person who sometimes got spooked by raccoons and stray cats, but better to check it out than ignore it. "I'll take that," Mitchell said before I could respond to dispatch. "Unit 7, responding," I told Danny, then looked at Mitchell. "You want to ride along? Good way to see how we handle things around here." He shook his head. "I'll walk over. Need to get a feel for the streets, learn the layout. Besides, I like to approach these situations on foot when possible. Less conspicuous." That made sense, I suppose. If there really was someone trying to break into Mrs. Chen's house, pulling up in a patrol car with lights and sirens would probably just scare them off before we could catch them. And if it was a false alarm, no harm done. Maple Street was only 4 blocks away, so I took my time driving over, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be running from the scene. The fog made it almost impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction, which would provide perfect cover for someone trying to escape on foot. I radioed dispatch to let them know I was en route and asked Danny to call Mrs. Chen back to get more details about what she'd seen. When I pulled up to 1247 Maple Street, I could see lights on in the front windows, and the porch light was burning bright. It was a modest 2-story house with white siding and black shutters, surrounded by a small but well-maintained yard. Mrs. Chen had lived there for over 40 years, and she took pride in keeping everything neat and tidy. There was a small garden along the side of the house where she grew tomatoes and flowers, and a detached garage in the back where she kept her late husband's old Buick. I was walking up the front steps when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk behind me. Mitchell had arrived, just as he'd said he would. I was impressed that he'd made it over so quickly on foot, especially in the fog. "Took you long enough?" I said, though it had only been about 5 minutes since we'd parted ways. "Had to check the perimeter first," he replied. "Found some interesting things back there. Definitely been someone poking around." Mrs. Chen opened the front door before I could knock. She was wearing a blue bathrobe over her nightgown, and her gray hair was in curlers. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she was clutching a cordless phone in her hand like it was a lifeline. "Officer Morrison, thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaking. "There's someone in my backyard. I saw them by the tool shed, and I think they were trying to get into my house." "We'll take a look, Mrs. Chen," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "This is Officer Mitchell. He's new to the department, just transferred in from Springfield." Mitchell stepped forward and took her hand in both of his, holding it gently like he was comforting a frightened child. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Every detail you can remember. It's important that we get a complete picture of what happened." The way he said it, the way he looked at her so intently, made me feel like I was watching a doctor examining a patient. There was something clinical about his attention, like he was studying her face and memorizing every detail. Mrs. Chen seemed to notice it too, because she pulled her hand back and took a small step away from him. "Well," she said, glancing between Mitchell and me, "I was in the kitchen making myself some tea. I don't sleep well these days, so I usually get up around 2 and have a cup of chamomile tea to help me relax. I was standing at the sink, waiting for the water to boil, when I looked out the window and saw someone by my tool shed." "What did they look like?" Mitchell asked, leaning forward slightly. I couldn't see their face because it was too dark, but they were wearing dark clothes and they had a flashlight. They were definitely trying to get into the house, testing the back door and looking in the windows. "Did they see you watching them?" I asked. "I don't think so." I turned off the kitchen light as soon as I saw them, and I watched from behind the curtain. They spent maybe 10 minutes back there, going around the house, checking all the doors and windows. "And then what happened?" Mitchell asked. "They just disappeared. One minute they were there, and the next minute they were gone. That's when I called 911. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that you did exactly the right thing. Too many people hesitate to call the police because they don't want to be a bother, but this kind of behavior is exactly what we need to know about. Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "We're going to make sure they don't," Mitchell said with a confidence that surprised me. "We're going to take a look around, and then we're going to make sure you're safe." "Let's check the backyard," I said, eager to get started with the investigation. We walked around the side of the house using our flashlights to cut through the fog. The backyard was small and enclosed by a chain-link fence with a gate that led to the alley behind the house. Mrs. Chen's tool shed was in the far corner, and I could see scuff marks in the dirt around it, where someone had been walking. "Definitely been someone here," I said, crouching down to examine the footprints. They were clear in the soft earth, made by what looked like work boots or hiking boots. Fresh prints, probably made within the last hour. "Look at this," Mitchell said, and I turned to see him examining the back door. Scratches around the lock. Someone was definitely trying to get in. I walked over to take a look. Sure enough, there were small scratches in the metal around the deadbolt. The kind you'd see if someone was trying to pick the lock or force it open with a screwdriver or other tool. But the lock itself was intact, and the door was secure. "They didn't get in," I said. "Mrs. Chen has good locks." "Yes, she does," Mitchell said quietly, running his fingers along the door frame. "Very good locks. Multiple deadbolts, reinforced strike plate. Someone's been thinking about security." The way he said it made me pause. There was something in his tone that suggested he was impressed by the security measures, but also like he was making mental notes about them. I was about to ask him what he meant when I realized he was no longer standing next to me. "Mitchell," I called out, sweeping my flashlight across the yard. "Where'd you go?" No response. I walked toward the back fence, checking behind the tool shed and in the corners of the yard where the shadows were deepest. The fog was so thick that he could have been 10 feet away and I wouldn't have seen him. "Mitchell," I called out again, louder this time. "Where are you?" Still nothing. I walked back toward the house, following the fence line, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. I checked the gate to the alley, but it was latched from the inside, which meant he couldn't have gone that way without me seeing him. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints I'd been examining, the ones that supposedly belonged to the would-be intruder, led directly to the back door of the house. But they weren't the prints of someone trying to break in. They were the prints of someone who had been pacing back and forth, like they were watching the house, studying it. And there was something else. A second set of prints, smaller and more recent, that led from the back door to the tool shed and then disappeared at the edge of the yard. I felt my radio buzz against my chest. Danny Rodriguez's voice came through with an urgency that made my heart skip a beat. Unit 7, we have Mrs. Chen on the line again. She says there's a police officer in her house who won't identify himself properly. She's locked herself in her bedroom and she's asking for you, specifically. What? I said, keying the mic. What do you mean there's an officer in her house? She says he came through the back door, claims he's doing a security check. She asked to see his badge and he showed it to her, but she says something about it doesn't look right. She's scared, Jake. She wants you to come back inside. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding. The back door was standing open, and I could see that the deadbolt had been turned from the inside. The kitchen light was on, and everything looked normal except for the fact that someone had been in the house without my knowledge. I drew my weapon and called out, "Police! Mitchell, where are you?" No response. I could hear voices upstairs, and one of them was definitely Mrs. Chen. She was crying and talking in a frightened whisper to someone I couldn't see. "Mitchell!" I shouted as I started up the stairs. "What the hell are you doing in here?" The voices stopped suddenly, and I heard a door slam somewhere on the second floor. When I reached the top of the stairs, I could see that Mrs. Chen's bedroom door was closed, and I could hear her sobbing on the other side. "Mrs. Chen, it's Officer Morrison," I said, knocking on the door. "Are you okay? Open the door." "Jake, is that really you?" she called out through the door. "How do I know it's really you?" "Mrs. Chen, it's me. I'm alone. Where's the other officer?" "He's not a real police officer," she whispered, and I had to strain to hear her. "His badge was wrong. The numbers didn't match what he told me before. And he knew things about my house, about where I keep things. He asked me about my late husband's gun collection, about whether I keep cash in the house. Jake, I'm scared." I tried the door handle, but it was locked. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to open the door. We need to talk about what happened." "He said he'd be back," she said, and I could hear the terror in her voice. "He said he knows all about me now, about my routine, about when I'm home and when I'm not. He said he'd be watching me." It took me another 10 minutes to convince her to open the bedroom door, and when she finally did, I could see that she was shaking with fear. She was still clutching the cordless phone, and her eyes were red from crying. "Tell me everything that happened," I said, sitting down on the edge of her bed. "After you went outside, I went back to the kitchen to finish making my tea. I was standing at the sink when I heard the back door open. I thought it was you coming back inside, so I called out to ask if you'd found anything. But when he came into the kitchen, something about him seemed different." "Different how?" "He was asking me questions about my house, about my security system, about whether I lived alone. And when I asked to see his badge again, he showed it to me, but the numbers were different from what he'd told me before. When I asked him about it, he just smiled and said that sometimes badges get reassigned." "What else did he say?" "He wanted to know about my daily routine, about when I go to the grocery store, when I go to church, when I visit my daughter in Omaha. He said it was for a neighborhood watch program, but the way he asked the questions, it felt like he was planning something." I spent the next hour searching the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of Mitchell. I checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. He had simply vanished. I called dispatch and asked Danny to run a check on Officer Thomas Mitchell, badge number 4471, supposedly transferred from Springfield PD. The response came back 20 minutes later. No record of any officer by that name in the Springfield Police Department database. No badge number 4471 had ever been issued by Springfield PD. No recent transfers to Millbrook County PD were on file with the state law enforcement registry. I sat in Mrs. Chen's living room, staring at my notepad and trying to make sense of what had happened. A man in a police uniform had approached me during my patrol, had claimed to be a fellow officer, and had somehow gained access to a citizen's home under false pretenses. But he looked so authentic, so professional. His uniform was perfect, his badge looked real, and he'd known the right things to say to gain my trust. "Mrs. Chen," I said, "I need to ask you something important. When this man was in your house, did he touch anything? Did he go through any of your belongings?" She thought for a moment. He asked to use the bathroom, and I pointed him upstairs. He was up there for maybe 5 minutes, longer than it should have taken. And when he came back down, he complimented me on my family photos. "What family photos?" "The ones in the hallway upstairs. Pictures of my late husband, my daughter, my grandchildren." He seemed to know a lot about them, asked about their ages and where they lived. I thought maybe he was just being friendly, but now... We went upstairs and I examined the hallway. There were indeed family photos lining the walls, but what caught my attention was a small framed document hanging near the bathroom door. It was Mrs. Chen's late husband's military discharge papers, and it included personal information like his social security number, his date of birth, and his military service record. "Mrs. Chen, does anyone else have a key to your house?" "Just my daughter, and the spare key hidden under the flower pot by the back door." I went outside and checked the flower pot. The spare key was still there, but the soil around it had been disturbed. Someone had definitely found it, and used it to gain entry to the house. By the time I finished my investigation, it was nearly 5 a.m. I'd filled out a report detailing the incident, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. On the surface, it seemed like a case of someone impersonating a police officer, but the level of preparation involved suggested something more serious. This wasn't a random prank or a simple case of someone playing dress-up. This was someone who had gone to considerable trouble to create a convincing false identity, and who had used that identity to gain access to a vulnerable person's home. I told Mrs. Chen to change her locks and to call me immediately if she saw or heard anything suspicious. I also gave her my personal cell phone number and told her to call me directly if she felt unsafe for any reason. She was still shaken by the experience, and I could tell that she was going to have trouble sleeping for a while. As I drove back to the station, I kept thinking about Mitchell's behavior, the way he'd studied Mrs. Chen's face when he introduced himself, the way he'd examined her security measures, the personal questions he'd asked. It all suggested that he was gathering information for some purpose, but what? The sun was coming up by the time I got back to the station, and I found Chief Patterson already at his desk, going through paperwork with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see the concern in his eyes. "Danny told me about the incident on Maple Street," he said. "Said you ran into some problems with a fake officer." "Chief, we need to talk about this. Someone's been impersonating one of our officers, and they had access to information they shouldn't have had." I told him everything that had happened, from my initial encounter with Mitchell to the discovery that he'd gained access to Mrs. Chen's house. Chief Patterson listened without interrupting, but I could see his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Jake, I want you to go home and get some rest. We'll pick this up tomorrow night when you come back on duty. In the meantime, I'm going to make some calls and see if we can figure out who this guy is." "Chief, I don't think we should wait. This guy knew too much about our procedures, about our patrol schedules. He's been watching us, studying us. And Mrs. Chen isn't the only elderly person living alone in this town. I understand your concern, but right now we don't have enough to go on. No crime was actually committed, and we don't have any physical evidence or witnesses except for Mrs. Chen's word against a person who may not even exist. That was the problem, wasn't it? How do you investigate someone who might not be real? How do you protect your community from a threat you can't identify or locate? I went home to my empty apartment and tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about Mitchell's confident smile and the way he'd said that trouble had a way of finding small towns like Millbrook. There was something about his demeanor that suggested he knew more about what was going to happen than he was letting on, like he was playing a game and I was just another piece on the board. When I woke up that afternoon, I found a message from Chief Patterson on my answering machine. He'd contacted the state police and the FBI to report the incident. And he'd also reached out to other law enforcement agencies in the area to see if they'd had similar experiences. So far, nothing. No other reports of fake officers, no similar incidents in neighboring counties. But as I was getting ready for work that evening, I got a call from Mrs. Chen. She was crying again, and her voice was shaking with fear. "Jake, he's back. He's in my backyard again." I told her to lock her doors and stay away from the windows while I drove over to her house. When I arrived, I could see her peeking through the curtains, but there was no sign of anyone in the yard. I searched the entire property, but found nothing except for fresh footprints in the flower bed under her kitchen window. "Mrs. Chen, are you sure you saw someone?" "I'm sure," she said. He was standing by the tool shed just like before. But when I turned on the porch light, he disappeared. I believed her, but I also knew that fear could play tricks on your mind. After a traumatic experience like the one she'd had the night before, it would be natural for her to be hypervigilant, to see threats where none existed. "I'm going to ask the day shift to increase patrols in this area," I told her, "and I want you to consider staying with your daughter for a few days, just until we can figure out what's going on." "I've lived in this house for 43 years, she said. "I'm not going to be driven out by some person pretending to be a police officer." I admired her courage, but I was also worried about her safety. If Mitchell was real, and if he was planning something, Mrs. Chen was in danger. And if he wasn't real, if he was just a figment of her imagination, brought on by stress and fear, then she needed help of a different kind. As I drove away from her house, I made a decision. I was going to catch this guy, whoever he was, and I was going to make sure he never had the chance to terrorize another innocent person. What I didn't know was that he was already 3 steps ahead of me, and that Mrs. Chen's house was just the beginning of a plan that would shake our small town to its core. The next few days passed quietly, and I began to wonder if maybe the incident with Mitchell had been a one-time thing. Maybe he was just a drifter who'd moved on to another town, another target. Mrs. Chen reported no further sightings, and our increased patrols in her neighborhood hadn't turned up anything suspicious. But then, on the night of October 19th, everything changed. I was patrolling the north side of town when I got a call from dispatch. There had been a break-in at the Millbrook First National Bank. The alarm had been triggered at 11:47 p.m., and the bank manager, Robert Carlson, was en route to meet me at the scene. The bank was located on Main Street, in the heart of downtown Millbrook. It was a small, independent bank that had been serving the community for over 60 years. The building was made of red brick and limestone, with large windows facing the street and a heavy wooden door with brass fixtures that gave it an old-fashioned, trustworthy appearance. When I arrived at the scene, I could see that the front door was standing open, and the lights were on inside. Robert Carlson was already there, standing on the sidewalk and looking nervous. He was a thin man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he'd been the bank manager for almost 20 years. "Jake, thank God you're here," he said, wringing his hands. "I got the call from the security company about 15 minutes ago. They said someone had triggered the motion detector in the main lobby. Have you been inside yet?" "No, I was waiting for you. The security company said they dispatched a patrol officer to check it out, but I haven't seen anyone." That was strange. We didn't have a security company contract with the bank, and I was the only officer on duty that night. I radioed dispatch to confirm, and Danny Rodriguez told me that he hadn't received any calls from a security company. Mr. Carlson, what security company are you talking about? Safeguard Solutions, he said. We just signed a contract with them last month. They're supposed to provide 24-hour monitoring and rapid response for break-ins and other security breaches. I'd never heard of Safeguard Solutions, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Small towns like Millbrook didn't usually attract the attention of major security companies, so it was possible that this was a regional outfit I wasn't familiar with. Let's go inside and see what we're dealing with, I said, drawing my weapon and motioning for Carlson to stay behind me. The front lobby looked normal at first glance. The teller windows were secure, the customer service desk was neat and orderly, and there was no sign of forced entry or damage. But as we moved deeper into the building, I started to notice things that didn't seem right. The door to the manager's office was standing open, and I could see that papers had been scattered across the desk. The filing cabinets were open, and it looked like someone had been going through the files. But nothing appeared to be missing, and there was no sign of vandalism or destruction. Mr. Carlson, does anything look out of place to you? He looked around carefully, taking inventory of the office. It's hard to say. Everything's been moved around, but I can't tell if anything's actually missing. The safe is still locked, and the cash drawers are secure. What about the files? Is there anything in there that someone might want? Customer account information, loan applications, financial records, standard banking documents. I was examining the filing cabinets when I heard footsteps in the lobby. Heavy boots on the tile floor, moving with purpose. I motioned for Carlson to stay quiet and moved toward the office door. "Police," I called out. "Identify yourself." "Officer Mitchell, Millbrook PD," came the response. "I'm here about the break-in." My blood ran cold. It was the same voice I'd heard 4 nights earlier, the same confident tone. I drew my weapon and stepped into the lobby, where I found Mitchell standing near the teller windows, examining them with a small flashlight. He looked exactly the same as he had before. Tall, professional, wearing a crisp uniform with all the right equipment. His badge was clearly visible, and his radio was crackling with static. But this time, I was ready for him. "Mitchell," I said, keeping my weapon trained on him. "We need to talk." He turned around slowly, and I could see the surprise in his eyes. "Morrison, what are you doing here? I thought you were patrolling the residential areas tonight." "I was, until I got called to respond to this break-in, the same break-in you're supposedly here to investigate." "I don't understand the problem," he said, raising his hand slightly. "Dispatch sent me over here to assist with the investigation." "That's funny," I said, "because dispatch told me that no one else had been assigned to this call, and last time I checked there was no Officer Thomas Mitchell on our force." Mitchell's expression didn't change, but I could see something shift in his eyes. The friendly, professional demeanor was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something calculating and cold. "I think there's been some kind of miscommunication," he said calmly. "Why don't you call it in and we can get this sorted out?" "Oh, I intend to," I said, reaching for my radio with my left hand while keeping my weapon trained on him with my right. "Danny, this is Unit 7. I need you to run another check on Officer Thomas Mitchell, badge number 4471, and I need backup at the First National Bank immediately." "Copy that, Unit 7, came Danny's voice through the radio. "Running the check now. Backup is en route." Mitchell smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "You know, Morrison, you're more observant than I gave you credit for." Most small-town cops would have just accepted my credentials without question. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "What do you want?" "What I want," he said, "is to understand how a place like this works. How the people think, how they live, what makes them feel safe. It's fascinating, really. All of this trust, all of this innocence." Robert Carlson had been standing behind me, listening to this conversation with growing confusion and fear. Now he stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Officer Morrison, what's going on?" "Who is this man?" "Mr. Carlson, I need you to go outside and wait for the backup units to arrive," I said, not taking my eyes off Mitchell. "This man is not a police officer." "But he showed me his badge," Carlson said. "He knew about the security system, about the alarm protocols. He said he was here to help with the investigation." "Mr. Carlson, go outside, now." Carlson hurried toward the door, and I could hear his footsteps echoing in the lobby as he left the building. Mitchell watched him go with what looked like amusement. "You're scared of me," Mitchell said. "Good, you should be, but not for the reasons you think." "Enlighten me." "I'm not here to rob your little bank, Morrison. I'm not here to hurt anyone, not directly. I'm here to study you, to understand how easy it is to walk into a place like this and become part of the community, to see how much trust people will place in a uniform and a badge." My radio crackled. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. No record of Officer Thomas Mitchell in any law enforcement database. No badge number 4471 has ever been issued. Backup units are 3 minutes out." "Copy that," I said, and then looked back at Mitchell. "So, what's your real name?" "Does it matter?" "Names are just labels, Morrison. What matters is what people believe about you. And right now, half this town believes I'm a police officer. Mrs. Chen believes it. Mr. Carlson believes it. Even you believed it, at least for a while." "What did you do to Mrs. Chen?" "I had a conversation with her. A very informative conversation. Did you know she keeps a detailed journal of her daily activities? Grocery shopping on Tuesdays, church on Sundays, visits to her daughter in Omaha once a month. Very predictable routine. If you hurt her..." "I didn't hurt her, Morrison. I didn't have to. She told me everything I wanted to know willingly, because she trusted the uniform, just like Mr. Carlson trusted me enough to give me the alarm codes for this bank." My heart sank. "He gave you the alarm codes?" "Oh, yes. Very cooperative, you're Mr. Carlson. When I told him I was conducting a security assessment for the police department, he was more than happy to share information about the bank's security measures. Alarm codes, safe combinations, cash handling procedures, everything. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. Backup was almost here, but I had a feeling Mitchell wasn't planning to stick around long enough to meet them. "Why?" I asked. "What's the point of all this?" "The point," he said, "is to prove how vulnerable places like this really are. How easy it is for someone like me to walk into your community and gain access to anything I want. Your police station, your bank, your citizens' homes. All it takes is the right uniform and the right attitude." "You're some kind of security consultant?" Mitchell laughed, and it was a sound that made my skin crawl. "Something like that. Let's just say I help people understand their vulnerabilities." The sirens were getting louder now, and I could see flashing lights through the bank's front windows. Mitchell heard them too, and his relaxed demeanor began to change. He was calculating distances, looking for exits. "Don't even think about it," I said, adjusting my grip on my weapon. "You're not going anywhere." "Actually, Morrison, I think you'll find that I am." He reached into his jacket pocket, and I tensed, ready to fire if he pulled out a weapon. But instead, he withdrew what looked like a small remote control device. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Some kind of electronic device. It's a signal jammer. Very useful for disrupting radio communications, cell phone signals, even security system frequencies. He pressed a button on the device and immediately my radio went dead. The static that had been constantly present in the background suddenly stopped, and when I tried to key the mic, nothing happened. "That's impossible," I said. "These radios operate on encrypted frequencies." "Nothing's impossible if you have the right equipment and the right knowledge. I know more about your communication systems than you do, Morrison. I know your patrol schedules, your response protocols, your backup procedures. I've been studying your department for weeks. The sirens were right outside now, and I could see patrol cars pulling up in front of the bank. But when I looked toward the front windows, I realized something was wrong. The emergency lights were flashing, but the cars weren't moving. They were just sitting there, engines running, but no one getting out." "What did you do?" I demanded. "I told you, Morrison, I help people understand their vulnerabilities. Your backup units are experiencing some technical difficulties. Radio problems, engine trouble, that sort of thing. They'll figure it out eventually, but it's going to take a while." I was starting to panic. My radio was dead, my backup was incapacitated, and I was alone in a bank with a man who was clearly much more dangerous than I'd initially realized. Mitchell seemed to sense my growing fear, and his smile widened. "This is what real power looks like, Morrison. Not the artificial authority that comes with a badge and a uniform, but the power that comes from knowledge, preparation, and understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves." "What do you want?" I asked again. "I want you to remember this night. I want you to remember how helpless you felt, how easy it was for me to manipulate not just you, but your entire department. And I want you to think about what might have happened if I'd been here for more than just a demonstration." He started walking toward the back of the bank, toward what I assumed was an emergency exit or employee entrance. I followed him, keeping my weapon trained on him. But I was acutely aware that he seemed to be controlling the situation completely. "The people of this town trust you to protect them," he said as we walked through the bank's offices. "But how can you protect them when you can't even protect yourself? How can you serve and protect when you don't even know who your enemies are?" We reached a door marked Emergency Exit, and Mitchell pushed it open. The alarm that should have sounded when the door opened remained silent, presumably disabled by whatever he'd done to the bank's security system. "This has been educational, Morrison. Thank you for your cooperation." "Wait," I said. "Who are you working for? Who's paying you to do this?" He paused in the doorway and looked back at me. "Nobody's paying me, Morrison. This is personal research. I'm writing a book about small-town law enforcement and the vulnerabilities inherent in rural policing. Tonight's little exercise will make an excellent case study." "A book?" "Oh, yes. The Thin Blue Line, How Rural Police Departments Fail Their Communities. Should be very popular in academic circles. Maybe even get picked up by a mainstream publisher." And then he was gone, disappearing into the fog and darkness behind the bank. I ran to the door and looked out, but I could see nothing except the alley and the backs of the buildings that lined Main Street. I tried my radio again, but it was still dead. I ran back through the bank to the front entrance, where I found my backup units finally getting out of their patrol cars. Officer Danny Wilson and Officer Sarah Martinez looked confused and frustrated. "Jake, what the hell happened?" Danny asked. "Our radios went dead, and then our engines started acting up. We couldn't even get out of the cars for about 10 minutes. "Electronic interference," I said. "The suspect had some kind of jamming device." "Suspect? What suspect?" I spent the next hour explaining what had happened, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. A man impersonating a police officer who had somehow disabled their patrol cars and communication systems. It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie, not a real police report. Chief Patterson arrived about an hour later, and he was even less receptive to my story. He listened to my account of events, but I could tell he was having trouble believing what I was telling him. "Jake, I want you to consider the possibility that stress might be affecting your judgment," he said. "You've been working a lot of overtime lately, and the incident with Mrs. Chen seems to have rattled you more than you want to admit. Chief, I know what I saw. This guy is real, and he's dangerous. He's been studying our department, learning our procedures, figuring out our weaknesses. Even if that's true, what can we do about it? We don't have a name, we don't have a description that we can trust, and we don't have any physical evidence. All we have is your word against nothing. What about the bank manager? He talked to this guy too. Mr. Carlson says he talked to someone claiming to be a police officer, but he never got a good look at his face and he can't provide any details that would help us identify him. For all we know, it could have been someone in a Halloween costume." That's when I realized the full extent of what Mitchell had accomplished. He'd managed to infiltrate our community, gather intelligence on our operations, and demonstrate our vulnerabilities, all while leaving virtually no trace of his presence. The only evidence that he'd ever existed was the testimony of a few confused and frightened citizens, and even that could be explained away as misunderstandings or stress-related hallucinations. But I knew he was real. I'd looked into his eyes, I'd heard his voice, I'd felt the menace that radiated from him like heat from a furnace, and I knew that this wasn't over. 3 days later, Mrs. Chen's house was burglarized. The thief knew exactly where she kept her valuables, knew her schedule, knew that she'd be at her doctor's appointment that Tuesday afternoon. The security footage from her neighbor's house showed a man in a police uniform walking up to her front door in broad daylight. He used a key. When Mrs. Chen returned home, she found that her late husband's gun collection had been stolen, along with jewelry, cash, and important documents. But the most disturbing discovery was a note left on her kitchen table. "Thank you for the information, Mrs. Chen. Your cooperation has been invaluable." I spent that entire night searching for any trace of Mitchell, any clue that might lead me to him. I drove through every neighborhood in Millbrook, checked every hotel and motel in a 50-mile radius, and contacted every law enforcement agency in the region. Nothing. It was as if he'd never existed. The weeks that followed were among the darkest of my career. Mrs. Chen moved to Omaha to live with her daughter, too frightened to stay in Millbrook after the break-in. Robert Carlson resigned from his position at the bank and moved his family to Colorado, unable to deal with the guilt of having inadvertently helped someone target his own community. The incident at the bank made the local newspapers, and soon everyone in town was talking about the mysterious fake police officer who had somehow managed to fool the entire police department. Chief Patterson ordered a complete review of our security procedures and background check protocols. He brought in consultants from the state police to evaluate our operations and recommend improvements. The city council held emergency meetings to discuss the department's competence and whether additional oversight was needed. But despite all of these efforts, we were no closer to identifying Mitchell or understanding what his true motives were. The FBI opened a file on the case, but without more concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They told us to be alert for similar incidents in other jurisdictions and to report any additional sightings immediately. I found myself becoming increasingly paranoid. Every time I saw another police officer I didn't recognize, every time someone called in to report suspicious activity, I wondered if Mitchell was involved. I started double-checking credentials and badge numbers, calling dispatch to verify the identity of officers I encountered in the field. my colleagues began to think I was losing my mind. And maybe I was. The incident had shaken my confidence in ways I hadn't expected. If someone could impersonate a police officer so convincingly that even I was fooled, how could I trust anyone? How could I do my job effectively if I couldn't even trust my own eyes? But then, on November 8th, I got a break. I was working the night shift again, patrolling the industrial area on the south side of town, when I saw a familiar figure walking along Railroad Street. Tall, confident posture, dark uniform. My heart started racing as I pulled over and got out of my patrol car. "Freeze! Police!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. The figure turned around, and I found myself looking at Officer David Reed, a perfectly legitimate member of our department who'd been working nights for the past 2 years. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" David asked, raising his hands. "It's me, David. We work together, remember?" I holstered my weapon, feeling embarrassed and confused. "Sorry, David. I thought you were someone else. Who did you think I was? The fake cop you've been chasing? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not thinking straight lately." David walked over to me, concern evident in his expression. "Jake, you need to talk to someone about this. You're seeing threats that aren't there. The whole department is worried about you." I knew he was right, but I also knew that Mitchell was still out there somewhere. I could feel it in my bones. The way you can feel a storm coming even when the sky is clear. He wasn't done with Millbrook, and he wasn't done with me. 2 days later, I found a package on my doorstep when I got home from work. It was a brown manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from Omaha. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Officer Morrison, thank you for the educational experience. Your department's vulnerabilities have been thoroughly documented, and the information will be invaluable for my research. Please don't take this personally. You're a good cop working in a broken system. The problem isn't with individual officers like yourself, but with the institutional complacency that allows people like me to operate with impunity. I hope your department learns from this experience and implements better security measures. For what it's worth, I think you showed admirable instincts during our encounters. In a different situation, you might have actually caught me. Best regards, T.M." At the bottom of the page was a photocopied image of Mrs. Chen's driver's license, along with detailed information about her medical history, her financial situation, and her daily routine. It was the kind of personal information that only someone with access to multiple databases and record systems could have obtained. I took the letter to Chief Patterson immediately. He read it carefully, then looked up at me with a mixture of anger and resignation. "Jake, this proves that you were right about this guy. He's real, he's dangerous, and he's been playing games with us from the beginning. So, what do we do now? We forward this to the FBI and hope they can trace the source, and we implement every security recommendation the state police consultants made, no matter how expensive or inconvenient. And if he comes back, then we'll be ready for him." But I wasn't convinced that we could be ready for someone like Mitchell. He demonstrated an ability to anticipate our responses, to stay one step ahead of us at every turn. He knew our procedures better than we did, and he'd shown that he could manipulate our systems and our personnel with frightening ease. The FBI analysis of the letter revealed nothing useful. The paper was standard office stock available at any office supply store. The typewriter was an old manual model that could have been purchased at any number of garage sales or antique shops, and the fingerprints on the envelope belonged to postal workers and mail carriers. The photocopied driver's license, however, was more troubling. The FBI determined that the copy had been made on a high-end commercial copier, the kind used in government, offices, or professional service firms. The level of detail in Mrs. Chen's personal information suggested that Mitchell had access to law enforcement databases, medical records, and financial institutions. This guy isn't just impersonating police officers, the FBI agent told Chief Patterson. He's operating like he has legitimate law enforcement credentials. Either he's extremely sophisticated in his methods, or he has inside help. That possibility, that someone within our own department or within the broader law enforcement community might be helping Mitchell, was almost too disturbing to contemplate. But it would explain how he'd been able to obtain so much detailed information about our procedures and personnel. Chief Patterson ordered background checks on every member of the department, including himself. He also implemented new security protocols for accessing departmental databases and required additional verification procedures for any requests for sensitive information. But despite these precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mitchell was still watching us, still studying us, still planning his next move. And I was right. On November 15th, exactly 1 month after my first encounter with Mitchell, Millbrook experienced its first murder in over 12 years. The victim was Harold Kowalski, the 78-year-old man I'd been checking on during my patrols. He lived alone in a small house on Elm Street, and his neighbors hadn't seen him for 3 days when they called the police to request a welfare check. I was the officer who found the body. Harold was sitting in his favorite chair in the living room, facing the television, which was still on. At first glance, it looked like he'd died peacefully in his sleep, maybe from a heart attack or stroke. But when the coroner arrived, he immediately noticed something that made him call for a full investigation. Harold's prescription medications were missing. All of them? His heart medication, his blood pressure pills, his diabetes medication. Everything that was keeping him alive had been removed from his house. The coroner's examination revealed that Harold had died from complications related to his diabetes and heart condition, but the timing suggested that his death had been accelerated by the sudden cessation of his medications. Someone wanted this to look like natural causes, the coroner told Chief Patterson. If the medications hadn't been missing, we might never have known it was anything other than an old man dying in his sleep. How long would it take for someone to die if their medications were suddenly stopped? I asked. Depends on the medications and the person's condition. In Harold's case, probably 3 to 4 days without his heart medication and insulin. The house had been searched thoroughly, but there was no sign of forced entry and no evidence of a struggle. Harold's doors were locked from the inside, and his spare key was still hidden under the garden gnome by his front door. Whoever had taken his medications had been invited into the house, or had convinced Harold to let them in. On Harold's kitchen table, we found a business card from Safeguard Solutions, the same security company that Mitchell had recommended to Mrs. Chen. Written on the back of the card in Harold's shaky handwriting was a note. Nice young police officer stopped by to check on security. Very helpful. That's when I knew for certain that Mitchell had killed Harold Kowalski. The FBI took over the investigation at that point, treating it as a federal case involving interstate crimes and the impersonation of law enforcement officers. They brought in a team of specialists to analyze the crime scene and to develop a profile of the suspect. What they found was deeply disturbing. The FBI determined that Harold's death was part of a larger pattern. Over the past 2 years, there had been at least 17 similar deaths in small towns across the Midwest. Elderly people living alone who had died from complications related to missing medications. In each case, neighbors reported seeing a police officer visiting the victim's home in the days before the death. This guy has been operating for a long time, the FBI agent in charge told Chief Patterson. He targets small towns with aging populations and inadequate law enforcement resources. He identifies vulnerable individuals gains their trust by impersonating a police officer, and then kills them in ways that look like natural causes. But why? I asked. What does he get out of it? We're not sure yet. There's no obvious financial motive. None of the victims had significant assets that were stolen. It could be psychological gratification, or it could be part of some larger experiment or research project. The mention of research reminded me of Mitchell's comment about writing a book, and I shared that information with the FBI. They were very interested in that detail, and it led them to focus their investigation on academics, journalists, and security consultants who might have access to the kind of resources Mitchell had demonstrated. But weeks passed without any significant leads. Mitchell had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only a trail of confused witnesses and dead elderly people. The stress of the investigation was taking its toll on everyone involved. Chief Patterson aged visibly during those weeks, the weight of responsibility crushing down on him like a physical force. The other officers became jumpy and suspicious, second-guessing every interaction with citizens and colleagues. And I found myself unable to sleep, haunted by the knowledge that I'd had multiple opportunities to stop Mitchell, and had failed each time. If I'd been more observant, more suspicious, more willing to trust my instincts, Harold Kowalski might still be alive. But the worst part was the growing realization that Mitchell wasn't finished with Millbrook. The FBI's profile suggested that he was methodical and patient, willing to spend months or even years developing his understanding of a target community before striking. Harold's death might have been just the beginning. The FBI's investigation continued through the winter months, but progress was frustratingly slow. They'd identified the pattern of deaths across multiple states, but they still had no solid leads on Mitchell's identity or whereabouts. The security company, Safeguard Solutions, turned out to be a front operation with no real office or employees. The business cards and promotional materials had been professionally printed, but they traced back to a commercial printing company that had no record of who had placed the order. Meanwhile, life in Millbrook gradually returned to something resembling normal. The heightened security measures became routine, and people stopped talking about the fake police officer who had terrorized our community. But I knew that the apparent calm was deceptive. Mitchell was still out there, and I was certain he wasn't done with us. My certainty was vindicated on February 14th, 2024. I was working the day shift that week, covering for Officer Martinez, who was attending a training seminar in Lincoln. It was Valentine's Day, and Millbrook was experiencing an unseasonably warm spell that had melted most of the snow and left the streets wet and gleaming in the afternoon sun. I was parked outside the elementary school, watching for speeders in the school zone, when my radio crackled with a priority call from dispatch. All units, we have a report of an armed subject at Millbrook Senior Center, 420 Oak Street. Caller reports a man in police uniform threatening residents and staff. All available units respond immediately. The senior center was only 6 blocks away, and I was there in less than 3 minutes. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see people streaming out of the building. Elderly residents being helped by staff members, everyone moving as quickly as they could toward the safety of the parking lot. I parked my patrol car at an angle to provide cover and approached the building cautiously. Through the large windows that faced the street, I could see into the main recreation room, where about 15 elderly residents were seated around tables, apparently being held against their will by someone I couldn't quite see. I radioed for backup and for an ambulance, then made my way to the front entrance. The doors were propped open, and I could hear a man's voice inside speaking calmly but authoritatively. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your cooperation. This is simply a security drill, designed to test the facility's emergency response procedures. Please remain seated and follow my instructions." I recognized the voice immediately. It was Mitchell. I drew my weapon and moved carefully through the entrance lobby toward the recreation room. I could see him now, standing at the front of the room near a small stage area. He was wearing a police uniform that looked identical to ours, complete with badge, utility belt, and radio. In his hands was what appeared to be a clipboard with official-looking documents. But there was something different about him this time. He looked older, more tired, and there was a nervous energy in his movements that I hadn't seen before. His confidence seemed forced, like he was playing a role that no longer came naturally to him. "Mitchell," I called out, stepping into the recreation room with my weapon drawn. "It's over. Let these people go." He turned toward me with what looked like relief rather than surprise. "Officer Morrison, I was wondering when you'd arrive." "Actually, I was hoping it would be you. Let them go, Mitchell. This isn't necessary." "Actually, it is necessary. Very necessary. You see, I've been having some problems lately. Problems with my research, problems with my methods. I think I may have made some errors in my analysis." The elderly residents were looking back and forth between us with confusion and fear. Most of them were in their 70s and 80s, and the stress of the situation was clearly taking its toll. I could see one woman clutching her chest and breathing heavily, possibly having a heart attack. "We can talk about your research later," I said. "Right now, I need you to let these people go. Some of them need medical attention." "That's exactly what I want to talk about, Morrison. Medical attention. Care for vulnerable populations. The responsibility that law enforcement has to protect people who can't protect themselves." He was pacing now, his movements becoming more erratic. The clipboard in his hands was shaking slightly, and I could see that his uniform was wrinkled and stained, like he'd been wearing it for days. "Mitchell, you're not making sense. Just put down whatever weapons you have and let these people go." "Weapons?" He laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. "I don't have any weapons, Morrison. I never did. The only weapon I ever had was your trust, and the trust of people like them." He gestured toward the elderly residents. "Then what's this about? Why are you here?" "I'm here because I made a mistake. A big mistake, and I need to fix it before it's too late." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the tables in front of the residents were small paper cups, the kind used for dispensing medications. And next to each cup was a selection of pills, different colors, different shapes, but all of them clearly prescription medications. "Jesus Christ, Mitchell, what did you give them?" "I gave them back their medications, Morrison. The medications I stole from Harold Kowalski before he died. The medications I've been stealing from elderly people all across the Midwest for the past 2 years." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You've been keeping their medications?" "I've been collecting them, studying them, trying to understand how easy it would be for someone to systematically target vulnerable populations by exploiting their medical dependencies. It was supposed to be research, Morrison, academic research. But Harold died. Harold died because I made an error in my calculations. I thought his body could survive longer without his heart medication. I thought I'd have time to return his pills before it was too late." The full horror of what he was telling me began to sink in. Mitchell hadn't just been impersonating police officers as some kind of intellectual exercise. He'd been conducting medical experiments on elderly people, using his false authority to gain access to their homes and steal their life-sustaining medications. "How many others?" I asked. 17 total, but Harold was the only one who died. The others, I always returned their medications within 72 hours. Just long enough to study the effects, to document their symptoms, to understand how quickly their conditions would deteriorate. You tortured them. I studied them. There's a difference. No, there isn't. Backup units were arriving outside, and I could hear car doors slamming and radios crackling. But I was afraid that if Mitchell felt cornered, he might do something desperate that would endanger the residents. Mitchell, I want you to walk slowly toward me and lie down on the floor. We can work this out, but I need you to surrender peacefully. I can't do that, Morrison. Not yet. First, I need to finish what I started. He turned back toward the residents and raised his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I need each of you to take the medications in front of you. These are your prescribed pills, the ones that were taken from your homes over the past several months. One of the residents, an old man with a walker, raised his hand shakily. Officer, I don't understand. Nobody took my medications. Mr. Peterson, isn't it? Mitchell consulted his clipboard. You live at 847 Birch Street, and you take digoxin for your heart condition, metformin for your diabetes, and lisinopril for your blood pressure. 3 weeks ago, I visited your home posing as a police officer conducting a security survey. While you were making coffee, I replaced your medications with placebos. The old man's face went white. That's impossible. I've been taking my pills every day. You've been taking sugar pills, Mr. Peterson, and your medical condition has been deteriorating as a result. The medications in front of you are your real prescriptions. A woman near the back of the room started crying. I've been feeling so weak lately. My doctor said my test results were getting worse, but he couldn't understand why. Mrs. Patterson, your medications were replaced 4 weeks ago. The decline in your health is a direct result of my intervention in your treatment regimen. I was listening to this exchange with growing horror. Mitchell had been systematically poisoning elderly people across multiple communities, stealing their medications and replacing them with placebos, then monitoring the effects on their health. It was one of the most cold-blooded and calculated crimes I'd ever encountered. Why? I asked. Why would you do this to innocent people? Because I wanted to understand how vulnerable they really were. How easy it would be for someone with bad intentions to exploit their trust and their dependence on medications. I wanted to document the failures in our system for protecting vulnerable populations. You're insane. No, Morrison, I'm a researcher. And my research has revealed some very disturbing truths about rural law enforcement and elderly care. Do you know how many of these people never received follow-up visits from your department after I stole their medications? Do you know how many of them called to report feeling unwell and were told it was probably just their age? He was right, and I knew it. We hadn't done follow-up checks on the elderly residents after the initial reports of the fake police officer. We'd assumed that Mitchell had moved on to another community, and we'd focused our attention on trying to catch him, rather than on protecting his potential victims. But you're giving them back their medications now, I said. You're trying to fix what you did. Yes, but it may be too late for some of them. Prolonged interruption of cardiac medications can cause permanent damage. Diabetics who've been without insulin for weeks may have suffered irreversible complications. More police officers were entering the building now, and I could see FBI agents among them. Mitchell seemed to sense that his time was running out. Morrison, I need you to understand something. I never intended for anyone to die. Harold's death was an accident, a miscalculation on my part. Everything else was carefully controlled, designed to be reversible. That doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't, but it makes it science rather than murder. The FBI agents were positioning themselves around the room, and I could see that they were preparing to move in. Mitchell saw them too, and his agitation increased. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out to the residents, I need you to take your medications now. All of them. Don't wait for the paramedics or the doctors. Your lives may depend on getting these drugs back into your systems as quickly as possible. Some of the residents began reaching for their cups of pills, but others hesitated, confused and frightened by the situation they found themselves in. "Mitchell," I said, "let the medical professionals handle this. These people need proper evaluation before they take any medications. There's no time for proper evaluation. Some of these people are in immediate danger because of what I did to them. They need their medications now." That's when I realized what Mitchell was really doing. He wasn't trying to hurt these people further. He was trying to save them. His entire elaborate scheme to gather them all in one place wasn't about conducting more experiments. It was about making sure they got their real medications back before they suffered permanent damage. "You planned this," I said. "You arranged for all of them to be here so you could return their medications at the same time. I had to. Some of them have been without their real medications for weeks. If I'd tried to return the pills individually, it would have taken too long. People would have died while I was trying to fix my mistakes." An FBI agent was moving closer, and I could see that he was preparing to make his move. But I held up my hand to signal him to wait. "Mitchell, if you really want to help these people, then surrender now and cooperate with the medical team. Let the doctors evaluate each person individually and determine the best way to restart their medications." "You don't understand, Morrison. The bureaucracy will kill them. Medical protocols, hospital procedures, insurance approvals. By the time all of that gets sorted out, some of these people will be dead. And if they take the wrong medications or the wrong dosages, they could die right here in front of us." Mitchell's face crumpled, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely defeated. "You're right. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I started this as an academic exercise, but it became something else. Something horrible. Then end it now. Put down the clipboard and let us help these people." He looked around the room at the frightened faces of the elderly residents, many of whom were clutching their cups of pills with shaking hands. Some had already started taking their medications, trusting in his authority even after everything they'd witnessed. "Mr. Peterson," Mitchell called out to the old man with the walker, "don't take any more of those pills until a doctor examines you. The same goes for all of you. I may have made mistakes in the dosages." That admission sent a wave of panic through the room. Several residents who had been about to take their medications put their cups down quickly, while others who had already swallowed pills began to look sick with worry. "Mitchell, you need to tell us exactly what you gave each person," I said. "We need to know the drug names, the dosages, everything." "It's all documented," he said, holding up his clipboard. "Every medication I took, every person I took it from, every day they were without their real prescriptions. I kept detailed records of everything." He walked slowly toward me, his hands raised to show that he wasn't holding any weapons. When he reached me, he handed over the clipboard and then lay down on the floor as I'd instructed. "Morrison," he said as I knelt down to handcuff him, "I want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing important research, documenting vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. You killed Harold Kowalski. I killed Harold Kowalski because I was arrogant and stupid and thought I could control variables that no one can control. I've been living with that guilt for months, and it's been destroying me." The FBI agents moved in then, taking custody of Mitchell while I coordinated with the paramedics who were arriving to evaluate the residents. The clipboard he'd given me contained detailed information about 17 elderly people across 6 states, including exact records of which medications had been stolen and when. What I found when I examined those records was almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Mitchell had been meticulous in his documentation. recording not just the medications he'd stolen but also the effects on his victims' health. He'd noted changes in their vital signs, their energy levels, their cognitive function, and their emotional state. It was like reading the lab notes of a scientist conducting experiments on human subjects. But buried in all of that clinical data was evidence of something else: genuine concern for his victims' welfare. He'd noted when people seemed to be declining too rapidly, and he'd shortened the experiment duration for several subjects when he became worried about their health. He'd even arranged for anonymous tips to be called in to local emergency services when he thought someone was in immediate danger. This is the most comprehensive documentation of a serial crime I've ever seen, the FBI agent in charge told me as we reviewed Mitchell's records. It's like he wanted to get caught, like he wanted someone to stop him. Maybe he did. Maybe that's why he kept coming back to Millbrook, why he kept escalating his interactions with our department. Over the next several hours, the paramedics evaluated each of the senior center residents and determined the safest way to restart their medications. Most of them were taken to the hospital for observation, and several required immediate treatment for complications related to their interrupted prescriptions. Miraculously, none of them died. The quick intervention and Mitchell's detailed records allowed the medical team to provide appropriate care before any permanent damage occurred. But the psychological trauma of learning that they'd been unknowingly victimized by someone they'd trusted was devastating for many of them. Mitchell was charged with murder in the death of Harold Kowalski, along with multiple counts of assault, fraud, impersonating a police officer, and endangering vulnerable adults across 6 states. The FBI estimated that his crimes had spanned nearly 3 years and had affected hundreds of people in dozens of small communities. During his interrogation, Mitchell revealed that his real name was Dr. David Russell Pierce, and that he was a former professor of criminology at the University of Missouri, who had been dismissed from his position after allegations of unethical research practices. He'd been conducting his fake police officer experiments as part of a book he was writing about vulnerabilities in rural law enforcement. "I wanted to expose the failures in the system," he told the FBI interrogators. "I wanted to show how easy it was for someone to exploit the trust that small communities place in law enforcement. But somewhere along the way, I became the very predator I was trying to warn people about." The psychological evaluation revealed that Pierce suffered from antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic traits. The psychiatrist who examined him concluded that while he was mentally competent to stand trial, his ability to empathize with his victims had been severely compromised by his academic detachment and his grandiose sense of his own importance. He genuinely believed that he was doing important work, the psychiatrist explained to Chief Patterson and me. In his mind, the suffering he caused was justified by the knowledge he was gaining. He saw his victims as research subjects rather than human beings. Pierce pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he was given the opportunity to address the court and the families of his victims. "I want to apologize for the pain I've caused," he said, though his tone remained clinical and detached. "My research methods were flawed, and I failed to properly consider the human cost of my work. I hope that the data I've collected will ultimately be used to improve security measures and protect vulnerable populations from people like me." Even in his apology, he couldn't stop thinking of himself as a researcher rather than a criminal. To the end, he seemed to believe that his crimes had scientific value that somehow mitigated their moral horror. The victims and their families were less forgiving. Harold Kowalski's daughter spoke at the sentencing hearing, describing the devastating impact of her father's death on their family. "This man didn't just kill my father," she said through tears. "He tortured him for days, watching him suffer, documenting his decline like he was a laboratory animal. There's no research value that could justify that kind of cruelty. Mrs. Chen, who had flown in from Omaha for the hearing, was more direct in her condemnation. "He stole more than our medications," she said. "He stole our sense of safety, our ability to trust. Every time I see a police officer now, I wonder if they're real or if they're another monster in disguise." The Pierce case, as it became known in law enforcement circles, fundamentally changed how police departments across the country approach credential verification and interagency communication. The FBI developed new protocols for sharing information about suspected imposters, and many departments implemented additional security measures to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive information. For our department in Millbrook, the changes were even more dramatic. Chief Patterson resigned 6 months after Pierce's arrest, unable to cope with the guilt of having allowed such a dangerous individual to operate in our community for so long. The city council hired a new chief from outside the county, someone with experience in dealing with more sophisticated crimes. The new chief, Maria Santos, implemented comprehensive reforms to our operations. We got new communication systems that were harder to jam, new procedures for verifying the identity of officers from other departments, and mandatory training on recognizing and responding to social engineering attacks. But perhaps more importantly, we changed how we thought about our relationship with the community. The Pierce case had shown us that our authority as police officers could be weaponized against the very people we were supposed to protect. We had to earn trust rather than simply expecting it, and we had to be constantly vigilant against those who would exploit that trust for harmful purposes. As for me, I requested a transfer to the detective division 6 months after Pierce's arrest. I couldn't handle patrol work anymore, couldn't drive through the neighborhoods where his victims had lived without thinking about what he'd done to them. The detective work suited me better, investigating crimes after they happened rather than trying to prevent them from happening in the first place. But I never stopped thinking about Pierce and what he'd represented. He wasn't just a criminal who had happened to target our community. He was a symptom of something larger and more troubling. The ease with which trust could be manipulated, the vulnerability of isolated populations, and the potential for educated, intelligent people to commit horrific acts while convincing themselves that they were doing important work. The most disturbing aspect of the case for me was how close Pierce had come to achieving his stated goals. His research had indeed exposed serious vulnerabilities in rural law enforcement, and his methods had been sophisticated enough to fool experienced officers for extended periods. If he hadn't made the mistake that led to Harold Kowalski's death, he might have continued his experiments indefinitely. In the months following his arrest, several academic papers were published analyzing the Pierce case and its implications for community policing. The authors praised Pierce's documentation while condemning his methods, and some argued that his research findings should be studied despite their unethical origins. That debate troubled me deeply. It suggested that there were people in the academic community who saw value in Pierce's work, who believed that the knowledge gained from his crimes might justify the suffering he'd caused. It made me wonder how many other researchers might be out there, conducting similar experiments under the guise of academic inquiry. But there was one positive outcome from the Pierce case that I hadn't expected. The national attention the case received led to increased funding for rural law enforcement agencies and elderly protection services. Grant money became available for upgraded communication systems, enhanced training programs, and community outreach initiatives designed to help vulnerable populations recognize and report suspicious activity. Mrs. Chen, who had moved back to Millbrook after Pierce's arrest, became an advocate for elderly safety and worked with our department to develop educational programs for senior citizens. She never fully recovered from the trauma of her experiences with Pierce, but she channeled her anger and fear into something constructive that helped protect others. "I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else," she told me during one of our meetings. That man took advantage of my trust, my loneliness, my desire to be helpful to law enforcement. But now I know what to look for, and I can teach other people to recognize the warning signs. Harold Kowalski's death remained a source of profound grief for our entire community. He'd been a kind man who had served his country in Vietnam and had spent his retirement years volunteering at the local food bank and mentoring troubled teenagers. His murder had robbed us of not just a valued community member, but also a piece of our collective innocence. The city erected a memorial in Harold's honor in the park downtown, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Harold Kowalski, who gave his life in service to his community's understanding of trust, vulnerability, and the need for vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves." It was a strange epitaph for a man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it captured something important about what his death had taught us. Trust was precious and fragile, and those of us entrusted with protecting others had a sacred responsibility not to abuse that trust or to allow others to abuse it. 3 years have passed since Pierce's arrest, and life in Millbrook has returned to something resembling normal. We still get the occasional drunk driving case, the occasional domestic dispute, the occasional teenager thinking they can outrun a police car on country roads. But now we approach every situation with a heightened awareness of the potential for deception and manipulation. I often think about what might have happened if I'd been more suspicious during my first encounter with Pierce on Elm Street that foggy October night. If I'd demanded to see his credentials, if I'd called dispatch to verify his identity, if I'd trusted my instincts instead of accepting his authority at face value, Harold Kowalski might still be alive, and 17 elderly people across the Midwest might never have been victimized. But I also know that Pierce was extraordinarily skilled at what he did. He'd spent years perfecting his techniques, studying law enforcement procedures, and developing the psychological tools necessary to manipulate his targets. Even if I'd been more suspicious, he might have found a way to convince me that he was legitimate. The real lesson of the Pierce case wasn't that individual officers needed to be more vigilant, though that was certainly part of it. The real lesson was that our entire system of trust and authority was more fragile than we'd realized, and that there were people in the world who were willing to exploit that fragility for their own purposes. It's been 5 years now since that first night I encountered Pierce on the foggy streets of Millbrook. 5 years since he first introduced himself as Officer Thomas Mitchell and began his campaign of psychological terrorism against our community. 5 years since I first felt that nagging sense that something wasn't quite right about the confident, professional-looking man in the police uniform. I'm 43 years old now, and I've been promoted to detective sergeant. I work primarily on financial crimes and fraud cases, which suits my temperament and my experience with Pierce's deceptive methods. I've developed a reputation in the department for being able to spot inconsistencies in people's stories, for picking up on the subtle signs that someone isn't telling the truth. But there's something I've never told anyone about the Pierce case, something that I discovered months after his arrest that changed everything I thought I knew about what happened in Millbrook. It started with a routine records request from the University of Missouri, where Pierce had been employed before he began his criminal career. They were conducting an internal investigation into his research practices and wanted copies of all the evidence we'd collected related to his activities in our jurisdiction. As I was going through the files to prepare the requested materials, I came across something that didn't make sense. It was a credit card statement from Pierce's wallet, seized at the time of his arrest, that showed a charge for gasoline in Millbrook on September 15, 2023, a full month before my first encounter with him on October 15th. That meant Pierce had been in Millbrook much longer than any of us had realized. He hadn't just shown up randomly and begun his experiments. He'd been here for weeks, maybe months, studying our community and planning his activities. Curious about what else I might have missed, I began going through all of Pierce's personal effects more carefully. His wallet contained not just credit cards and identification, but also small pieces of paper with notes written on them. Most of the notes appeared to be random observations about people and places, but a few of them contained information that made my blood run cold. One note, written in Pierce's careful handwriting, contained my home address, my work schedule, and personal details about my ex-wife and daughter. Another note had similar information about Chief Patterson, including the fact that he took medication for high blood pressure, and that he lived alone after his wife's death 2 years earlier. Pierce hadn't just been studying our community in general. He'd been studying us, the police officers who might potentially investigate his activities. He'd been gathering intelligence on the very people who were supposed to catch him. But the most disturbing discovery was a small notebook hidden in a secret compartment of Pierce's wallet. The notebook contained detailed psychological profiles of every officer in our department, including assessments of our strengths, weaknesses, and likely responses to various situations. About me, Pierce had written, Morrison, 15 years experience, mostly night shift, divorced, isolated, drinks too much, strong instincts but tends to second-guess himself. Father issues may make him susceptible to authority figures, likely to accept credentials at face value if approached with sufficient confidence. Primary weakness, wants to believe people are fundamentally good. About Chief Patterson. Patterson, 25 years as chief, close to retirement. Overworked and understaffed department has made him dependent on help from outside agencies. Proud of department's reputation, defensive about criticism. Likely to resist admitting that security has been compromised. Primary weakness, institutional loyalty overrides individual judgment. About Officer Martinez. Martinez, young, ambitious, eager to prove herself. Recently transferred from larger department, may be frustrated by limited opportunities in small town. Likely to be skeptical of strangers, but also impressed by apparent competence. Primary weakness, wants to be seen as professional and capable. Pierce had profiles for every single member of our department, and reading them was like looking into a distorted mirror that reflected all of our professional and personal vulnerabilities. He'd understood us better than we understood ourselves, and he'd used that understanding to manipulate our responses to his presence in our community. But there was something else in the notebook that was even more troubling. Pierce had been keeping track of other police departments in the region, noting which ones might be suitable targets for his research and which ones would be too difficult to infiltrate. He'd rejected the county sheriff's department because they had better communication systems and more rigorous verification procedures. He'd rejected the state police because their officers were more experienced and less likely to be fooled by his impersonation. He'd chosen Millbrook specifically because we were understaffed, overworked, and trusting to a fault. Millbrook PD represents ideal target for infiltration study, Pierce had written. Small department, limited resources, aging population provides cover for elderly victim selection. Officers appear competent but not suspicious. Community trust levels high. Estimated timeline for complete infiltration, 3 to 6 months. The implication was clear. Pierce had been planning to spend months in Millbrook, gradually insinuating himself into our community and our department until he could operate with complete impunity. Harold Kowalski's death had forced him to accelerate his timeline, but his original plan had been much more ambitious. I thought about all the things that could have happened if Pierce had been able to continue his work undetected for months. how many elderly people he could have victimized, how much damage he could have done to our community's sense of safety and trust, how completely he could have compromised our department's effectiveness and reputation. But the most chilling realization was that Pierce's ultimate goal hadn't been to study small-town policing. It had been to demonstrate that it was possible for a sufficiently motivated individual to completely take over a small law enforcement agency from the inside. One of his final notebook entries, dated just days before his arrest, revealed the full scope of his ambitions. Phase 2, establish permanent identity within department. Recommend hiring of qualified candidate to fill staffing gaps. Phase 3, gradual assumption of leadership responsibilities as senior officers retire or transfer. Phase 4, complete institutional control within 2 to 3 years. Pierce hadn't just been conducting academic research. He'd been planning a hostile takeover of our police department, using his false credentials and psychological manipulation to gradually work his way into a position of authority over the very people whose job it was to protect the community from people like him. When I showed this information to Detective Santos, our new chief, her reaction was swift and decisive. She ordered a complete security review of the department and implemented new procedures designed to prevent any future infiltration attempts. She also contacted the FBI to share Pierce's intelligence-gathering methods with other law enforcement agencies. "This changes everything we thought we knew about the Pierce case," she told me. He wasn't just a criminal who happened to target elderly people in small towns. He was conducting a systematic study of how to compromise rural law enforcement from within. The FBI was equally disturbed by the discovery. They reopened their investigation into Pierce's activities and began looking for evidence that he might have successfully infiltrated other police departments during his 3-year crime spree. What they found was even more frightening than Pierce's notebook had suggested. In 2 other small towns where Pierce had operated, local police officers had reported that they'd worked with helpful transfer officers from other departments who had provided valuable assistance with investigations. In both cases, these officers had disappeared without explanation, and there was no record of their employment with the departments they claimed to represent. The FBI now believes that Pierce successfully established false identities within at least 3 police departments, and that he may have been operating multiple personas simultaneously across different jurisdictions. The full extent of his infiltration activities may never be known, since he destroyed most of his records before his final arrest in Millbrook. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was that Pierce hadn't been working alone. Further investigation revealed that he'd been in contact with at least 12 other individuals who were conducting similar research into law enforcement vulnerabilities. Some were academics like Pierce, others were security consultants, and still others appeared to be motivated by anti-government ideology or simple criminal opportunism. "We're not dealing with an isolated case," the FBI agent in charge of the expanded investigation told Chief Santos and me. "We're dealing with a coordinated effort to identify and exploit weaknesses in rural law enforcement." Pierce was just one node in a much larger network. That network, which the FBI dubbed Operation False Flag, had been operating for at least 5 years and had successfully compromised dozens of small police departments across the Midwest and South. The members of the network shared information about successful infiltration techniques, vulnerable targets, and law enforcement countermeasures to avoid. Pierce's arrest had disrupted the network's activities, but it hadn't destroyed it entirely. Several other members were arrested in coordinated raids, but others simply disappeared, presumably to establish new identities and begin fresh infiltration attempts in different regions. The knowledge that Pierce had been part of a larger conspiracy made me question everything I thought I knew about the case. Had our encounters really been as random as they'd seemed, Or had Pierce been following a predetermined script designed by the network to test our responses? How many other Officer Mitchells were out there right now, walking into police stations and sheriff's departments with fake credentials and friendly smiles? The paranoia that followed these revelations was almost as destructive as Pierce's original crimes. Every new officer, every transfer, every helpful colleague from another department became a potential threat. Trust between agencies broke down as everyone began demanding additional verification of credentials and background checks. But gradually, over the course of months, a new equilibrium emerged. Law enforcement agencies developed better communication systems and more robust verification procedures. Training programs were expanded to include instruction on recognizing and responding to infiltration attempts. And most importantly, the culture of unquestioning trust in uniforms and badges was replaced by a healthy skepticism that made future Pierce-style operations much more difficult. 5 years later, I can say with confidence that our community and our department are stronger and more secure than they were before Pierce arrived. We've learned to trust but verify, to remain vigilant without becoming paranoid, and to protect our citizens without losing sight of the fact that the greatest threats sometimes come from those who claim to be our allies. But I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking about Pierce's notebook and his detailed psychological profiles of everyone in our department. I wonder how long he spent studying us, watching us, learning our habits and vulnerabilities. I wonder what other secrets he discovered about our community that he never had the chance to exploit. And sometimes, when I'm working a case involving fraud or deception, I find myself thinking like Pierce, trying to understand how someone could use trust and authority as weapons against innocent people. It's a dangerous way of thinking, but it's also necessary. To catch predators, you have to understand how they think, how they operate, how they choose their victims. The Pierce case taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it comes wearing a uniform and a badge, speaking in calm, professional tones, offering help and protection while secretly planning destruction. Sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones who look exactly like the heroes we expect to save us. That's the lesson I try to pass on to the young officers who join our department now. Trust is a precious resource that must be protected and verified. Authority is a responsibility that must be earned and maintained through consistent action, not just claimed through credentials and symbols. And most importantly, the people we serve deserve better than blind faith in uniforms and badges. They deserve police officers who understand that their trust is a gift, not a right, and who work every day to prove themselves worthy of that gift. Pierce may have thought he was conducting an academic exercise, but he taught us something far more valuable than anything that could be published in a research journal. He taught us that the price of freedom and safety is eternal vigilance, not just against criminals and terrorists, but against those who would exploit our trust and manipulate our faith in the institutions that protect us. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. But there's one more thing about the Pierce case that I've never told anyone. Something that still haunts me 5 years later. Something that makes me question whether we really caught the right person, or whether the real Thomas Mitchell is still out there somewhere, watching and waiting and planning his next move. It happened 3 weeks ago, on a foggy October night that reminded me uncomfortably of that first encounter with Pierce on Elm Street. I was working late at the station, going through cold case files when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office. Heavy boots on linoleum, walking with purpose and confidence. I looked up to see a figure pass by my open door, tall, well-built, wearing what looked like a police uniform. But it was late, and I was the only one scheduled to be in the building. I called out, but got no response. I grabbed my weapon and followed the sound of the footsteps through the station. They led me to the evidence room, where I found the door standing open and the lights on. Inside, someone had been going through the Pierce case files, spreading documents across the work table like they were conducting their own investigation. But whoever it was had vanished. The evidence room was empty, and there was no sign of forced entry or disturbance. The only thing out of place was a single piece of paper left on the table. A photocopy of Pierce's notebook page containing his psychological profile of me. At the bottom of the page, someone had written a new note in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to Pierce's. Phase 5. The student becomes the teacher. The lesson continues. I've analyzed that handwriting, run it through every database I can access, and compared it to every piece of evidence from the Pierce case. It's not Pierce's handwriting. He's been in maximum security prison for 5 years, with no possibility of outside contact, but it's close enough to suggest that whoever wrote it had studied Pierce's methods very carefully. I've also reviewed the security footage from that night, but the cameras malfunctioned between 11:47 p.m. and 11:52 p.m., exactly the 5-minute window when the intruder would have been in the building. A technical glitch, according to the security company. Just like the kind of glitch that Pierce used to create when he wanted to move around undetected. Chief Santos has ordered a full investigation, but so far we've found no evidence of who might have been in the building that night or how they gained access to secured areas. It's possible that it was just a pranks. Someone trying to spook me by referencing the Pierce case. But the level of preparation and knowledge required suggests something more serious. I think Pierce's network is still active. I think they're still out there studying law enforcement agencies, looking for new vulnerabilities to exploit. And I think they've decided that Millbrook would make an excellent testing ground for their next phase of operations. The note mentioned, the student becomes the teacher, which suggests that someone who learned from Pierce's methods is now planning to implement them on their own. Someone who studied his successes and failures, who understands what worked and what didn't, and who believes they can do better. If I'm right, then everything we've done to secure our department and protect our community may not be enough. We may be facing an opponent who knows exactly how we'll respond to their actions because they've studied our responses to Pierce. Someone who can anticipate our countermeasures because they understand our psychology and our procedures better than we understand them ourselves. The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if every shadow outside my window might be hiding someone who's watching me, studying me, preparing to use my own trust and authority against me and the people I've sworn to protect. Because that's the real legacy of the Pierce case. Not just the knowledge that such people exist, but the understanding that they never stop evolving, never stop learning, never stop finding new ways to exploit the fundamental human need to trust and be trusted. And in a world where the uniform means everything and nothing, where authority can be claimed as easily as it can be earned, the only real protection is the constant awareness that the next person who offers to help might be the one you need protection from the most. The badge is supposed to represent safety, service, and protection. But Pierce taught us that it can also represent the most dangerous weapon of all, the ability to make people trust you enough to let you destroy them. That's a lesson worth remembering, even if it's not one any of us wanted to learn. I remember sliding into the driver's seat of my patrol car just after 2:03 a.m., the dashboard clock glowing faintly in the darkness. My name is Frankie Malone, badge number 4783, and I've been putting in night shifts in Pierce County, Washington, since before automatic transmissions were standard issue. That night, October 7th, 2018, began like any other. A quiet beat through University Place, a couple of routine property checks, the usual static hiss on Channel 2 between calls. I was alone, lights off, letting the glow of the street lamps guide me past shuttered storefronts and empty parking lots. mind wandering back to the sandwich my wife packed before bed and to my son's cough that wouldn't go away. Then dispatch came through, low and clipped, checking to see if I'd relayed status on a broken lock at the 24-hour convenience store on Meridian. I flipped the rig into park outside the store, the engine rumbling quieter than my heart. I stepped out, boots crunching the wet gravel, and dialed in. The pavement smelled like rain and stale coffee. The flickering neon "open" sign barely held on through a cracked tube, throwing one anxious flicker against the wall. I jotted the report. Lock mechanism jammed, door swinging too freely in the breeze. No suspects, no immediate danger. I signed off, then looked back toward my car. The radio clicked once as if acknowledging me, then went dead. I reached for the mic again, thumb pressing the PTT, but nothing came through. Dead air. I switched channels. Channel 4, Channel 5. Silence. I tapped the scanner knob, cycled through every frequency I knew. The red, calm light above the rearview mirror glowed stubbornly, unmoving. I glanced down at my phone. No service. My hand trembled, but I clipped it shut and clipped the phone back in my pocket. Adrenaline tingled along my spine. I leaned back against the hood, willing the rig to cough back to life. The convenience store's little wall clock ticked loud in the emptiness, each second feeling heavier. I stepped back inside and checked the console. No loose wires, no blown fuses. Everything looked green and nominal. Yet I hadn't heard a single dispatch call in over 2 minutes. I drove to the mid-county substation in Lakewood, headlights cutting through mist swirling low to the ground. The glow of streetlights ahead seemed to sputter, each lamp dying in turn like candles blowing out in a breeze. I eased into the lot and saw 2 more patrol cars, Martinez's and Griggs's, idling in the chain-link fence enclosure. Their amber beacons spun lazily, painting the fence posts in halos of yellow. I pounded on Martinez's window. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Griggs rolled down his passenger window, coffee cup rattling in the cup holder. Neither of them had heard dispatch in the last 5 minutes. Not a peep, not even static. I ran through the standard comm-out drill, reboot the headsets, swap radios, check the antenna connectors, even try the handheld backup unit. But nothing. Lieutenant Harper showed up, flashlight slicing through the gloom. He barked orders. "Get the techs out here now." We slipped on reflective vests and followed the chain-link fence to the radio tower compound half a mile down the road. Every footstep echoed in the mist. The gate was secured with a padlock that looked fresh. No rust, no wear. When Harper unlatched it, the motion-activated floodlight above crackled on, then stuttered out, plunging us into darkness again. We crossed under the tower's lattice, flashlights off. I heard nothing but my own ragged breath and the distant drip of water somewhere deep in the fog. I moved to the generator shed, expecting a low hum. Instead, everything was silent, dead. The panel lights inside the tiny building were off. I flicked the shed light switch, nothing. I snapped open the door of the panel box, stared at rows of breakers and fuses, all in the on position. No physical damage, no burned contacts, no plausible explanation. We climbed back into the cruiser, the wet leather seat cold against my jacket. Martinez's in-car speaker crackled suddenly, a faint whisper trailing through the crisp air. We all froze. The speaker that should have been dead sputtered out a name. "Malone," it hissed, my badge ID. The sound was distorted, like it was coming from a speaker underwater. Then it said something I'll never forget. "You left your kid's medicine on the counter." My pulse thundered. My hand shot to my holster before I realized I'd been home 2 days ago, medicine cabinet stocked, Griggs swung the door open and wheeled around, flashlight beam trembling. "Did you hear that?" he demanded, voice tight. Martinez's eyes were wide, tears shining in the flashlight glare. She pressed the PTT button again. It clicked, but no voice returned. Not even static. Yet the whisper had come through clear enough to make me question every thought I'd ever thought in private. We looked at each other, the three of us huddled in that car, faces lit by amber dash lights. Suddenly, the cruiser's console blared with a system error chime, followed by a recorded female voice reciting channel diagnostics in a calm, mechanical tone. Channel 12, offline, channel 15, offline, rerouting to backup network unavailable. We piled back into Martinez's cruiser and raced toward dispatch headquarters in Tacoma. The highway was empty, headlights reflecting off slick pavement. The mist trailed behind us like a cloak. My radio, dead for 10 minutes, suddenly burst to life with a dispatch call. Not the one we expected, but a soft, urgent plea. "Officer Malone, report your location. Officer Malone, report your location." It sounded like Dispatcher Reynolds, but when I opened my mouth to speak, only static poured through the speaker. I watched Martinez's eyes flick to mine in the rearview mirror. We knew then this wasn't a simple communications glitch. When we arrived at the dispatch center, the front doors were unlocked, corridor lights off except for a single pale bulb in the vestibule. We pushed through, boots echoing on linoleum tiles, and found the rows of consoles dark and empty. Two dispatchers, Patel and Hughes, sat at their stations, slumped forward. Patel's headset lay on the desk, mic bent. Hughes's monitor flashed with error logs stretching back days. Entries for calls never made, logs of transmissions from officers who'd retired years ago. The room smelled like stale air and fear. Patel's head lolled. She muttered something about hearing footsteps behind her, whispering, "You shouldn't be here." Hughes sat rigid, hand hovering over his console like he was waiting for someone to give him the word. Then the overhead speakers clicked on, a faint buzz rising to clarity. The voice was neither male nor female, more like machinery reciting fragments. "All units proceed to B57. Repeat, B57 now, child's cry. Feed the engine, numbers in the dark." The words made no sense together. Martinez slammed her palm on the console, eyes wild, and the speakers died. Seconds later, every monitor blinked back on, normal traffic flashing across the lines as though nothing had happened. Patel and Hughes snapped awake, blinking like they'd just woken from a nightmare, but when we asked them what they'd seen, they only stared blankly. We left a dispatch in a silent convoy, sirens off, unable to speak. Not a word passed between us. As dawn broke beyond the windows, lights returned to the console panels, and for a moment there was relief. But I felt the chill of that voice echo in my bones. We drove away into the gray morning, each of us carrying the same question. If our radio is supposed to be the lifeline we trust, then what, and who, was pulling the other end when we called? I eased off the accelerator on the drive back to my beat, the silence in the cab thicker than any radio static. Daylight was washing out the world in a pale gray, but it felt more like a spotlight on every unsolved question from the night. By 6:10 a.m., I was back on Meridian, past the convenience store whose lock I'd reported. Its door was now secured, the neon sign dark, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the hollow in my chest that tightened every time I glanced over. I flicked my lights on and off at the front porch of a tidy duplex, my next check, and the little bulbs sputtered twice before stabilizing. My breath came faster than usual, and I realized I'd left my hand on the holster for longer than a movement warranted. The radio remained dead. I clicked through channels again, but tonight's glitch seemed permanent. I sat for a moment, thumb resting on the mic, and imagined that distorted whisper might come back. Malone, feed the engine. That phrase lingered like a warning rather than an instruction. I knocked on the door of the duplex. No answer. The window blinds were drawn, and the small front lawn looked trampled, as though someone had cut across it in a hurry. I circled the building, boots crunching under early frost, and saw footprints leading around the side to the back alley. They were too small to be my own and too numerous to be a deer. I ducked behind a nearby SUV, flashlight in hand, and followed the prints to where they ended at a dark, open doorway beneath an external stairwell. The doorway led into the basement of a closed cafe. No open sign, no business hours, just a sheet of plywood nailed across the entry that someone had pried loose. I called out, voice echoing into dampness. "Pierce County PD, show yourself." My reflection crawled across chipped paint on the walls. I heard shifting behind a stack of wooden crates. I pressed forward, every nerve alive. My flashlight landed on a man slumped in the corner, head hanging, arms folded. He wore a hoodie stamped with faded campus letters and jeans stained at the knees. His breathing was shallow, labored. I crouched in front of him. "Hey, you okay?" No response. I tapped his shoulder. He jolted upright, eyes wild, darting around as though someone was whispering in his ear. His lips moved, but there was no sound. I pulled my cuff light and signaled Martinez on the passenger channel, but no signal. I reached for the man's wrist, cold, clammy, and saw a cell phone resting in his palm, screen cracked, locked on a phone call timer that read 00:3:22. The timer was still running, but there was no audio, no indication of whom he'd called. He fell forward onto my boots, limp. I dragged him up and half carried him back into the alley, calling over my shoulder for backup. But the substation was empty, and Lieutenant Harper was heading out on another call when I'd left. I didn't have time for protocols. I pushed him into the front seat of my cruiser and strapped him in. His eyes flicked open, pupils darting, but he wouldn't speak. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and drove. I dialed 911 on his phone's emergency function. Maybe it would patch through a different tower, but it rang endlessly, then went to voicemail. I took him to St. Peter's Hospital in Tacoma, parked behind the ER where an ambulance crew stood watching me approach. I told them, in clipped breaths, that I'd found him unresponsive in an abandoned cafe basement. They took him inside on a stretcher just as Nurse Rodriguez slammed the ambulance bay doors back shut. I stepped aside and tried calling dispatch again, still dead, but then my cruiser's speaker crackled with a distorted laugh, low and guttural. I spun, hand on my holster, but no one was there. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud enough for the entire parking lot to hear. "You drive her home. Feed the engine." 2 EMTs burst back out, shouting questions. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told them I'd delivered him to them and needed to check on something else. They stared, confusion and fear registering on their faces. I backed toward my car, heart racing. My cruiser's window was smeared with something dark, rainwater mixed with mud or worse. I swiped it with my sleeve. No smell, no texture, just a smear that wouldn't wash off by wiper or rain. I brushed at it again, motion growing frantic until Lieutenant Harper appeared behind me, pistol drawn, eyes wild. "Get away from that car," he ordered. "We don't know what it is." I froze, palm sweating on the door handle. He stepped forward, peered through the glass. "Frankie, He didn't finish. His radio chirped to life for the first time since midnight. "All units, respond to 1152 Evergreen Road. Possible holdup in progress. Officer down." It was dispatch, clear, calm, normal. Harper balanced his pistol hand, lowered it, and frowned. "You heard that?" he asked. I nodded, voice tight. "Yeah, and I just lost it again." We looked at my cruiser's console, calm light, blinking green. The screen displayed a channel override message, then switched back to patrol frequency. The wiper blade ticked across the windshield, smearing mud in a perfect spiral. Harper holstered his pistol and patted me on the shoulder. "Let's get moving." I climbed in, engine turning over smoothly. My radio crackled with chatter from every corner of the county. Officers en route, dispatchers clearing calls, normal life resuming over the airwaves. I clicked back to the channel I'd been on all night, dead silent. I took a deep breath. "Harper, I can't shake this," I said. "Someone's been inside our channels. They know things. They're messing with us." He nodded, face grim. "We'll sort it," he said. "Let's bring that hostage suspect in, then we'll figure it out." We rolled out toward Evergreen Road under flashing lights, sirens muted by the weight of what had transpired. Street lamps lit our path, but the fog still clung to the ground like a blanket, and half-formed shapes loomed at the edge of the beams. The radio in my hand felt like a toy, powerless and unreliable. The night had dragged us through every shadow we feared, every echo we hated, and now it was handing us calls as if nothing had changed. My grip on the wheel tightened. My knuckles whitened. I wondered how many officers ahead of me would hear the voice next. How many would lose their tools, their sense of safety, and how many would get it back. At 11:52, Evergreen, we found a rattled homeowner pinned behind a locked door. A swaying lamp inside, silhouette moving past windows. Martinez and Griggs were already on scene, guns drawn but faces tight with uncertainty. My radio finally held a steady tone, dispatch calling for updates. I answered carefully, voice low, conscious of how clear and normal it sounded. The homeowner told us she'd hid in the pantry when she heard someone ramming the front door. We cleared the rooms methodically, first floor, second floor, but found no one. Only the house's own creaks, settling noises in the walls, and my own breaths rattling in my ears. I caught Martinez's eye across the hallway. She was chewing her lip, hand shaking on her flashlight. I nodded once, a silent promise that we'd get through this. We backed out, letting the homeowner lock herself in her back room until uniformed backup arrived. I patted Harper's shoulder as we stepped onto the porch. "All clear," I radioed. He exhaled, tension uncoiling in his shoulders. But I felt none of that release. The night had slipped into dawn, and yet the static in my mind refused to settle. We turned toward the cruiser, and I saw on the neighbor's porch a hastily scribbled note taped to the door. "Feed the engine." No signature, no date, just those words scrawled in frantic strokes. I blinked, stepping closer. My boot nudged a small smear on the door frame, same dark muck that had tainted my windshield. I pressed a finger to it, watching it smear under my fingertip. I wiped it on my pant leg, it smudged red. I shook my hand, flinching. Harper said, "You good?" But I couldn't answer. I stared at the note until the words blurred. I thought of my wife's face when she asked if I had enough Tylenol for our son. I thought of the voice telling me he'd forgotten it on the counter. I thought of every call that had gone wrong, every channel that had betrayed us. And I realized with a hollow certainty that nothing would ever feel normal again. I folded the note into my pocket and climbed in. As I buckled up, the cruiser's speaker sputtered one last time. A child's giggle, barely audible, faded into static. I killed the engine, radio crackling off, and sat in silence until the storm inside me quieted enough to move. Then I drove on, shadows stretching long ahead, wondering if the next whisper would come from this world or from somewhere I'd rather not imagine. The sky had lightened to a bruised lavender by the time I pulled back onto Meridian, the street lamps flickering out one by one, as though the world were expiring in slow motion. My radio was dead again, and for a moment I simply sat, engine idling, letting the weight of every whispered message settle in my chest like concrete. I felt the note crumpled in my pocket, a manila scrap that smelled faintly of sweat and spilled coffee. Its jagged letters still scrawled, "Feed the engine." I closed my eyes and pictured that phrase echoing inside my skull, reverberating against bones, until it became impossible to tell where I ended and it began. My shift was almost over, but there was no comfort in going home. I thought of my wife, Sarah, sleeping, and of my son Lucas, wincing through his cough. I imagined the medicine still sitting on our kitchen counter, untouched. The voice hadn't mentioned feeding an engine before. It had said, "You left your kid's medicine on the counter." Now it demanded I feed an engine. I considered turning around, driving back to see if I'd actually forgotten it, but logic snapped at that idea. Medicine belonged in a cabinet, not next to a stove, not in a shorthand command from something that wasn't human. I slid the cruiser into drive and eased forward, tires humming over damp asphalt. The station lights came into view, sterile white bulbs seething through the gloom. In the parking lot, only one other car remained, Lieutenant Harper's unmarked SUV. I parked beside it, shut off the engine, and climbed out onto the cold pavement. Harper was already there, leaning against his door, arms crossed, eyes fixed on nothing. He didn't look my way as I approached. "Thought you were heading home," he said without turning. "I can't," I replied. My own voice sounded foreign, cracked around edges. "Not until I know what the hell's going on." He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. "I've been thinking, Frankie. Maybe we're looking at this wrong. It's not the radios, it's not the towers, it's us." "Us?" I echoed. My breath fogged in front of my mouth. "How do you figure?" He shrugged. "We're the ones carrying it around. Every call we take, every secret we whisper to ourselves on the midnight shift, it all gets picked up, twisted, and thrown back at us." He tapped the notepad in his breast pocket, though he didn't pull it out. "I've been reviewing past incident logs. You, Martinez, Griggs, all of us have had unexplained errors, phantom calls, static voices that mimic dispatchers. But the worst part, the information being spooled back, is always personal." I rubbed my forehead, feeling a dull ache. "So, you think it's our minds? Some kind of mass psychosis?" He shook his head. "Not collective, individual. We each carry something broken, and tonight that's been our undoing." He glanced at my cruiser. "What about this smear on your windshield?" I shook my head. "I don't know. It's like mud, but darker, like dried blood diluted with water. It won't wash off." I tapped the glass, and for a second I thought I saw my reflection warp, eyes too wide, mouth twisting. Then it was gone. Harper sighed and stepped back. "Look, I called it in. Medical techs are headed to your house to check on your family. Make sure you didn't actually leave that medicine out. I'm going to call in the department psychologist. We need someone who understands the mind, not wires." He glanced at his own radio. "And if this thing is inside our heads, we need to know how it got there." I wanted to argue, to say this was bigger than mental stress, but the horror in Martinez's voice as she described hearing her daughter's name over the speaker, I couldn't discount it. I nodded slowly. "Okay." He opened his SUV door. "Get home safe. We lock down the channels at midnight tomorrow. No exceptions until we figure this out." He paused. "Drive slower than usual." I watched him climb in and pull away, taillights fading. I climbed back into my cruiser, hands trembling on the wheel. I put the engine on idle and stared at the dashboard. The calm light blinked green, then dark. I reached for the gear shift, thumb brushing the note in my pocket. I closed my fist around it, feeling the paper crease deeper into my skin. I thought of the voice's final taunt in dispatch. Numbers in the dark, feed the engine, child's cry. The fragments made no literal sense, but they all tied back to me. My son's cough, the medicine I hadn't forgotten but that I feared I might. The miles I'd driven in empty parking lots burying questions I'd never asked. The static didn't just distort radio. Static distorted reality until I wasn't sure what was fact anymore. I reached for the radio mic and keyed it. Dispatch, this is 4783. My voice came out steady, but nothing responded. Only silence. I let go of the button and exhaled, hearing the breath escape like air from a punctured tire. I thought about Martinez, how she'd stared at that dark smear on her car, trembling so badly I thought she might pass out. I thought about Griggs, who'd gone pale when the voice had named him and told him of debts he thought he'd buried years ago. We were 3 pieces in a machine that had no right to read our private history, let alone recite it back like a threat. I eased the cruiser into drive and pulled onto the road that led to my house. Every headlight that passed me flickered once, twice, as though checking identity, as though making sure I wasn't carrying something within me. I caught my reflection in a passing SUV's window, my face lined and haggard, eyes red-rimmed, shadowed by too many nights of half-wakefulness. I looked away before the window could blink back. I turned down my street, the familiar houses gray and silent, curtains drawn tight. My own porch light remained off. I'd left it that way, not wanting anyone to think I was home. The medicine cabinet in my kitchen gleamed under the hall light. The small orange bottle of pediatric cough syrup sat waiting. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was exactly where it belonged. But relief turned to dread when I noticed the counter edge was smeared with the same dark residue. A streak that cut across the synthetic countertop like a fingerprint. I approached cautiously, paying attention to every creak in the floorboards. My boot scuffed against the smear near the stool. I knelt and pressed a fingertip into it. This time it came away on my skin, thick and oily, as though someone had drawn blood from the wood grain. The scent was metallic and cold. My stomach turned. I stood and backed away, heart pounding so hard I feared it would burst through my chest. I reached for the note in my pocket, unfolded it, held it up to the overhead light. The letters were smudged as though someone had wiped them clean, but faint grooves remained. FEEDTHEENGINE. I looked toward the hall where my son's room lay. His cough had lulled into silence by now, but I imagined hearing it again, a dry rasp in the darkness. I pressed the note between the medicine bottles as though that would contain it. Behind me, I heard the radio behind the dashboard click on. The comm light blinked back to life. I froze. My pulse shuddered. A voice, her voice, dispatch's voice, cut through the static. Clear as a bell. "Malone, time's up. Feed the engine." I spun, peering into the windshield and through the living room window. Empty street, no headlights, no one there. My skin prickled as the radio sputtered, the lights in my house flickering in shallow arcs, as though the circuits were overloaded by unseen currents. I dared a step forward, hand gripping the doorframe. In the silent kitchen, the phone on the wall began to ring, shrill and urgent, though I'd unplugged it months ago. The medicine bottle rattled on the counter. The note rustled under an invisible breeze that stirred nothing else. I stared at the radio, knowing that if I keyed the mic, something, even if only my own voice, would answer back. I clenched my teeth and reached down, hand shaking, to unplug the radio. The panel lights in the dashboard winked out one by one. The kitchen light flickered, then steadied. The phone stopped ringing. Silence again, heavy as midnight. I backed away, chest heaving, until I felt the living room wall at my fingertips. I turned to face the darkness of the hall, to the door of my son's room where the faintest crack of light shone. I wanted to step toward it, to see him, to make sure he was safe. But I held still, knowing that whatever had gotten inside our channels, whatever had learned our names and our fears, could be waiting in that doorway, waiting to manipulate the rhythms of our lives one whisper at a time. And so I stood there, anchored between the radio and the hall, listening for a breath that wasn't mine, waiting for the next command that would prove beyond doubt I was never truly alone. The word feed kept echoing in my mind, but I couldn't decide what that meant anymore. Feed the engine, feed the fear, feed the silence. I felt the darkness press in, felt my own heart sink under its weight, and I realized that no matter how I acted, how I drove, how I hid, how I tried to silence the static, it was only a matter of time before the radio came alive again. And when it did, I knew that the most terrifying truth wouldn't be the voice itself, but the knowledge that it knew me better than I knew myself.